Terra in the late 30th millennium bore little resemblance to the verdant cradle of humanity that had once birthed mankind's stellar empire. The Age of Strife had transformed the homeworld into a nightmare of irradiated wastelands, toxic oceans, and warring fiefdoms ruled by techno-barbarian warlords who commanded armies equipped with degraded technology from the Dark Age. The planet's surface had become a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each controlling vital resources or strategic territories, their rulers wielding power through a combination of scavenged archaeotech, genetic manipulation, and sheer brutality. The skies churned with industrial pollutants and the aftereffects of ancient atomic exchanges, while vast hive cities rose like cancerous growths from the scorched earth, their populations enslaved to the ambitions of petty tyrants. Into this hellscape emerged the Emperor, a being of immense psychic power and singular vision, who began his campaign to reunite humanity under a single banner. His conquest was methodical and relentless, beginning in the Himalayan mountains and spreading outward through calculated military campaigns that combined superior strategy, advanced technology, and the application of his own formidable abilities. The Thunder Warriors, genetically enhanced super soldiers created through the Emperor's mastery of biological science, formed the spearhead of his armies. These warriors stood head and shoulders above normal men, their bodies swollen with muscle, and their temperaments barely controlled aggression. They were instruments of conquest rather than peacekeepers, designed to break the power of the techno-barbarian kingdoms through overwhelming force. The Unification Wars consumed decades of brutal fighting across Terra's scarred surface. The Emperor's forces systematically dismantled the power structures of the techno-barbarian warlords, incorporating their armies and resources into the growing imperial war machine. The Nordific conclaves fell after protracted siege warfare that reduced their fortress cities to rubble. The Pan-Pacific Empire, which controlled vast stretches of the irradiated Pacific Basin, resisted fiercely but ultimately succumbed to the combined might of the Thunder Legions and the Emperor's strategic genius. Each victory brought more territory under imperial control, more resources to fuel the war effort, and more warriors to swell the ranks of the growing armies. The final and most formidable opposition came from the Indonesic bloc, a powerful techno-barbarian empire that controlled significant portions of the planet's equatorial regions. The bloc possessed advanced technology, including functional force field generators and plasma weaponry that made their fortifications nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Their armies were well-trained and equipped, their leadership competent and determined to resist imperial domination. The war against the Indonesic bloc represented the bloodiest phase of the Unification Wars, with the Thunder Warriors suffering casualties that would have broken lesser forces. The Emperor himself took to the field during critical engagements, his presence turning the tide of battles that threatened to stall the imperial advance. The final assault on the bloc's primary strongholds required the deployment of forbidden weapons, archaeotech devices whose use the Emperor sanctioned only under the most dire circumstances. When the Indonesic bloc finally fell, Terra stood united under imperial rule for the first time in millennia. Yet even as the Emperor consolidated his control over Terra, he understood that his ambitions extended far beyond the reclamation of humanity's birthworld. The Great Crusade that would carry humanity back to the stars required resources and technology that Terra alone could not provide. The planet's manufactories, though numerous, lacked the sophisticated knowledge and production capacity necessary to equip the armies needed for galactic conquest. The Emperor needed advanced weapons, warships capable of traversing the warp, and the technical expertise to maintain and improve upon the technologies recovered from the Age of Strife. For these requirements, there was only one source: Mars. The red planet had followed its own path through Old Night, the catastrophic period when warp storms isolated human worlds and plunged the galaxy into darkness. While Terra descended into techno-barbarism and nuclear warfare, Mars survived through the rigid hierarchies and dogmatic preservation practices of the cult Mechanicus. The Mechanicum, as the priesthood of Mars called itself, had maintained control over the Forge world through a combination of religious authority and technological monopoly. Their creed centered on the worship of the machine god, a deity they believed resided within all technology and machinery. Knowledge was sacred, innovation was heresy unless sanctioned by the highest tech priests, and the recovery and preservation of ancient technological artifacts became a religious imperative. The Mechanicum's survival through Old Night was not without cost. The warp storms that isolated Mars from Terra and the wider galaxy also trapped the Forge world in a state of technological stagnation. The tech priests could maintain and reproduce existing technologies with remarkable precision, but true innovation became increasingly rare as the centuries passed. The standard template construct systems that had once allowed human colonists to recreate advanced technology on distant worlds were lost or corrupted, their databases incomplete or infected with scrap code from the cybernetic revolt that had preceded Old Night. The Mechanicum compensated for these losses through obsessive cataloging and ritualistic maintenance of every machine and device under their control. Vast data vaults beneath the surface of Mars contained fragmentary records of technologies from the Dark Age of technology, jealously guarded by tech priests who spent lifetimes attempting to decipher and reconstruct ancient knowledge from corrupted files and incomplete schematics. The forged temples of Mars dominated the planet's surface, massive structures that combined industrial production with religious worship. Manufactorums the size of hive cities churned out weapons, vehicles, and components according to patterns that had remained unchanged for millennia. The Mechanicum's adherence to established templates ensured consistency and reliability, but it also meant that Mars produced technology that, while functional and durable, often failed to match the sophistication of artifacts recovered from the Dark Age. The tech priests venerated these ancient devices as holy relics, studying them obsessively in hopes of unlocking their secrets, while simultaneously declaring that true understanding could only come through divine revelation from the machine god. Mars governed itself through the Mechanicum Parliament, a council of the most powerful tech priests and forge masters who controlled the various forge temples and production facilities across the planet. The Parliament operated according to Byzantine protocols and political maneuvering that made the techno-barbarian kingdoms of Terra seem straightforward by comparison. Fabricator locum positions were contested through demonstrations of technical prowess and political alliance building, with rival factions supporting different candidates based on ideological differences regarding the interpretation of Mechanicum doctrine or control over valuable technological resources. The Parliament's decisions shaped Martian policy, determined production priorities, and controlled access to the most sacred technological knowledge preserved in the data vaults. When the warp storms finally abated and Mars regained awareness of the wider solar system, the Mechanicum found itself in a precarious position. Terra, once the seat of human civilization, had been conquered by a being who claimed dominion over all humanity. The Emperor's forces possessed advanced technology and military might that threatened Martian independence, yet Mars could not survive indefinitely in isolation. The Forge world required raw materials from Terra and the asteroid belt, resources that the Mechanicum's own mining operations could not provide in sufficient quantities to maintain production at necessary levels. The population of Mars, already heavily augmented with cybernetic implants and dependent on constant technological maintenance, needed organic materials and rare elements that could only be sourced from other worlds in the solar system. The Emperor recognized Mars as both an opportunity and a potential threat. The Mechanicum's technological expertise and production capacity were essential to his plans for the Great Crusade, but Mars also possessed the industrial might to resist Imperial conquest or even threaten Terra itself if the tech priests chose confrontation over cooperation. A military campaign against Mars would be costly, potentially devastating to both sides, and would destroy the very manufactories and knowledge bases that made the Red Planet valuable. The Emperor needed Mars intact and cooperative, which meant diplomacy rather than conquest would determine the relationship between Terra and the Forge world. Initial contact between Imperial and Mechanicum forces occurred through carefully orchestrated demonstrations of capability and intent. Imperial void ships, newly constructed in the orbital shipyards above Terra, made their presence known in the space between the two worlds. These vessels represented a significant achievement for the nascent Imperium, proof that Terra had regained the capacity for void warfare and possessed the technical knowledge to construct warp-capable ships. The Mechanicum responded by activating ancient defense satellites and orbital weapons platforms that had remained dormant since Old Night, a clear message that Mars possessed the means to defend itself against aggression. The Emperor chose to approach the Mechanicum not as a conqueror, but as a potential ally, dispatching envoys to Mars who carried proposals for mutual cooperation. These initial diplomatic overtures emphasized shared goals and complementary needs rather than demands for submission. Imperial representatives spoke of humanity's destiny among the stars, of reclaiming lost colonies and reuniting scattered human populations under the protection of a unified government. They offered Mars access to Terra's resources and protection from external threats in exchange for the Mechanicum's technical expertise and production capacity. The Mechanicum Parliament received these overtures with suspicion and intense debate. Conservative factions within the tech priesthood argued for maintaining Martian independence and rejecting any alliance that might compromise the cult Mechanicus's religious autonomy. More pragmatic voices pointed out that Mars could not afford isolation, that the Forge world's survival depended on access to resources that only cooperation with Terra could provide. The debate consumed weeks of parliamentary sessions, with different factions presenting technical analyses, theological arguments, and political calculations to support their positions. The turning point came when the Emperor himself demonstrated capabilities that the Mechanicum could not ignore. His understanding of technology went beyond mere competence, revealing knowledge of principles and techniques that the tech priests believed lost since the Dark Age. More significantly, the Emperor displayed psychic abilities that suggested a connection to forces the Mechanicum associated with their machine god. Whether through careful calculation or genuine belief, key figures within the Mechanicum began to interpret the Emperor's powers as evidence of divine favor, suggesting that cooperation with Terra might align with the will of the machine god itself. The Emperor's knowledge of Mars extended far beyond what his diplomatic overtures suggested to the Mechanicum Parliament. Beneath the surface of the Red Planet, imprisoned within the labyrinthine passages of the Noctis Labyrinthus, lay one of the galaxy's most dangerous entities, a shard of the Katan known as the Void Dragon. This fragment of a star god had influenced Martian civilization for millennia, its presence shaping the development of the cult Mechanicus in ways the tech priests themselves did not comprehend. The Emperor's willingness to negotiate with Mars rather than conquer it stemmed partly from his awareness of this imprisoned entity and the delicate balance its presence created. The Katan were beings of immense power that had existed since the galaxy's formation, entities of living energy that fed upon stars themselves. During the War in Heaven, the ancient conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr, the Katan had allied with the Necrontyr and been granted physical forms of living metal. These star gods possessed abilities that defied conventional understanding of reality, capable of manipulating matter and energy at fundamental levels. The Void Dragon, also called the Dragon of Mars in fragmentary records, represented one of the most technologically oriented of these entities, its very nature aligned with the manipulation and control of machinery and technological systems. The circumstances of the Void Dragon's imprisonment remain obscured by the passage of millennia and conflicting accounts preserved in the most restricted archives of the Imperium. Some records suggest the Emperor himself confronted and defeated the entity during Terra's ancient past, during an era when humanity first began to master technology and spread across old Earth. These accounts describe a battle that reshaped landscapes and left scars visible for thousands of years, a confrontation between a being of divine psychic might and a fragment of a star god whose power over technology made it nearly invincible against conventional weapons. The Emperor, according to these fragmentary sources, did not destroy the Void Dragon shard, but instead imprisoned it, recognizing that complete destruction might be impossible or that the entity's continued existence served purposes that only he fully understood. The choice of Mars as the prison location was deliberate and calculated. The red planet's distance from Terra provided a buffer against the entity's influence, while keeping it within the solar system where it could be monitored. The Noctis Labyrinthus, a vast system of interconnected canyons and underground passages on the Martian surface, offered natural containment enhanced by whatever mechanisms the Emperor employed to bind the Khatan shard. The imprisonment was not perfect. Fragments of the Void Dragon's consciousness could still reach outward, influencing the minds of those who came near or who possessed the right sensitivity to its presence. This subtle influence would prove instrumental in shaping human civilization on Mars over the following millennia. When human colonists first arrived on Mars during humanity's initial expansion into the solar system, they established settlements and industrial facilities that tapped into the planet's mineral wealth. These early Martians developed a culture that emphasized technological achievement and mechanical innovation, traits common to frontier colonies dependent on life support systems and advanced machinery for survival. However, the proximity to the imprisoned Void Dragon shard introduced an additional element into Martian cultural development. The entity's influence, operating at levels below conscious awareness, encouraged an increasingly reverent attitude toward technology itself. Machines became more than tools. They began to be seen as possessing inherent worth and even a form of consciousness or spirit. The Age of Strife accelerated this transformation. As warp storms isolated Mars from Terra and the wider human empire, the Martian population faced catastrophic challenges that threatened their survival. The colony's dependence on advanced technology made the preservation of knowledge and manufacturing capability paramount. Religious structures that had begun to form around technological worship solidified into the cult Mechanicus, a formal priesthood dedicated to the machine god. The tech priests believed this deity resided within all machines, that technology itself was divine, and that proper maintenance and operation of machinery constituted religious observance. They could not perceive the true source of these beliefs, the subtle psychic emanations from the imprisoned Khatan shard that reinforced and amplified humanity's natural tendency toward pattern recognition and anthropomorphization of complex systems. The Void Dragon's influence manifested in specific aspects of Mechanicum doctrine and practice. The tech priests' obsession with binary cant, the machine language that became their sacred tongue, reflected the entity's fundamental nature as a being of pure logic and mathematical precision. The Mechanicum's belief that the Omnissiah, the physical avatar of the machine god, would one day come to Mars and lead them to enlightenment echoed the Void Dragon's own desire for freedom and the unconscious recognition among the tech priests that their god was somehow imprisoned or incomplete. The elaborate rituals surrounding the activation and maintenance of machinery, while practically useful in preserving ancient technology, also served to strengthen the psychic resonance between the Mechanicum and the entity beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. The binary nature of Mechanicum thinking, the reduction of complex moral and philosophical questions to logical calculations, the emphasis on efficiency and function over emotion and intuition, reflected the Void Dragon's own consciousness. Khatan did not think as organic beings did. Their minds operated according to principles that predated biological life in the galaxy. The fragment imprisoned on Mars influenced the tech priests towards similar modes of thought, encouraging the replacement of organic tissue with mechanical augmentation, the suppression of emotion in favor of pure reason, and the belief that flesh was inherently weak while metal was strong and eternal. These doctrines served the Void Dragon's interests by creating a population increasingly compatible with its own nature, potentially making them more susceptible to its control should it ever achieve freedom. The Emperor's knowledge of the Void Dragon's presence on Mars complicated his approach to securing an alliance with the Mechanicum. He understood that the tech priest's religious beliefs, while based on the influence of an imprisoned star god rather than genuine divine revelation, served crucial functions in Martian society. The cult Mechanicus provided social cohesion, preserved technological knowledge through religious ritual, and motivated the tech priests to maintain the vast industrial infrastructure that made Mars valuable. Attempting to reveal the truth about the machine god risked catastrophic consequences. The Mechanicum might reject the revelation entirely, leading to conflict, or the knowledge might somehow weaken the Emperor's own mechanisms for containing the Void Dragon Shard. The Emperor's decision to allow the Mechanicum to maintain their beliefs represented a calculated compromise between ideological purity and practical necessity. His own philosophy, which would later be formalized as the Imperial Truth, rejected all forms of religious worship and superstition. He sought to lead humanity away from faith and toward rationalism, to eliminate the influence of chaos and other warp entities by denying them the belief and worship that sustained them. Yet on Mars, he chose to make an exception. The Mechanicum would be permitted to worship their machine god, to maintain their religious hierarchy and rituals, in exchange for their technological expertise and industrial production. This decision involved risks that the Emperor clearly understood but deemed acceptable given the alternatives. The Void Dragon's continued imprisonment required constant vigilance and the maintenance of whatever bindings held it in place. The Mechanicum's presence on Mars, their constant activity and technological work throughout the planet's industrial complexes, might actually help reinforce these bindings through mechanisms the Emperor had established millennia earlier. The Tech Priests' worship, directed at what they believed to be a benevolent machine god, created psychic patterns that differed from the Void Dragon's true nature, potentially confusing or diluting the entity's ability to influence events beyond its prison. The alternative, attempting to conquer Mars by force and impose the Imperial Truth on the Mechanicum, would almost certainly destabilize the careful balance maintaining the Void Dragon's imprisonment. Military conflict on Mars might damage the containment mechanisms, or the chaos and violence could provide the entity with opportunities to extend its influence in unexpected ways. The Emperor had fought the Void Dragon once before, according to the fragmentary records, and that confrontation had nearly destroyed him despite his immense power. He had no desire to repeat that battle, especially not while simultaneously preparing for the Great Crusade and managing the countless other threats facing nascent Imperium. The Emperor's approach to the Mechanicum therefore involved a form of deception by omission. He would present himself in ways that aligned with their existing beliefs, allowing them to interpret his abilities and knowledge through the lens of their religious doctrine. When he demonstrated understanding of technology that surpassed even the most learned tech priests, they could attribute this to divine favor from the machine god rather than his own ancient knowledge and psychic abilities. When he spoke of unity and cooperation, they could hear echoes of their prophecies regarding the Omnissiah. The Emperor would become what the Mechanicum needed him to be, not through explicit claims of divinity, which would contradict his own principles, but through careful presentation and the tech priest's own desire to find validation for their beliefs. This strategy required the Emperor to maintain secrets from his closest advisors and future subordinates. The existence of the Void Dragon, its imprisonment on Mars, and its influence on the cult Mechanicus could not become common knowledge. Such information would be restricted to the Emperor himself, and perhaps a handful of individuals whose loyalty and discretion were absolute. The tech priests of Mars would continue their worship, unaware that their machine god was actually a fragment of a star god that would gladly consume them if it achieved freedom. The broader Imperium would be taught to view the Mechanicum as eccentric but useful allies whose religious peculiarities were tolerated due to practical necessity. The long-term implications of this decision would reverberate throughout Imperial history. By allowing the Mechanicum to maintain beliefs rooted in the Void Dragon's influence, the Emperor created a permanent theological division within his empire. The Adeptus Mechanicus would remain semi-autonomous, their religious practices exempt from the otherwise universal prohibition on worship and superstition. This exception would later complicate efforts to enforce the imperial truth across conquered worlds and provide ammunition for those who question the Emperor's consistency in applying his own principles. More dangerously, it meant that a significant portion of the Imperium's technological infrastructure would remain under the control of an organization whose foundational beliefs derived from the influence of an entity that represented an existential threat to humanity. The Emperor's gamble rested on his confidence that the benefits of Martian cooperation outweighed these risks. The Mechanicum's manufacturing capacity, their preserved knowledge of Dark Age technology, and their expertise in maintaining and operating complex machinery were essential to the Great Crusade. Without Mars, the Imperium could not build the thousands of warships needed to reconquer the galaxy, could not equip the Space Marine legions with the weapons and armor they required, could not maintain the logistical networks necessary to support armies fighting across countless worlds. The Emperor needed Mars functional and cooperative, which meant accepting the Mechanicum's religious beliefs regardless of their true origin. The Emperor's arrival on Mars represented a moment of unprecedented significance for the Mechanicum. His delegation descended to the surface aboard a heavily modified transport that bore markings of both Imperial and Mechanicum origin, a deliberate symbolic gesture indicating the potential for cooperation between the two powers. The vessel landed at the primary starport serving Olympus Mons, the massive shield volcano that housed the most important forged temples and served as the seat of Martian government. The tech priests who witnessed the landing recorded every detail in their data banks, analyzing the transports designed for hints about Terran technological capabilities and the Emperor's intentions. The Fabricator General who led Mars during this critical period commanded authority through a combination of political acumen, technical expertise, and control over key forge complexes that produced weapons and components essential to Martian defense. This individual had risen through the Mechanicum hierarchy during the latter years of Old Night, navigating the Byzantine politics of the Martian parliament while maintaining the delicate balance between competing forge temples and tech priest factions. The Fabricator General's augmentations reflected decades of service to the machine god. Much of the original biological form had been replaced with sophisticated mechanical systems that enhanced cognitive processing and allowed direct interface with Mars' vast data networks. When the Emperor's delegation requested formal negotiations, the Fabricator General convened an emergency session of the Parliament to determine Mars' response. The Parliament chamber occupied a vast space within the heart of Olympus Mons, its walls lined with data screens and cogitator banks that displayed real-time information about production quotas, resource allocations, and the status of forged temples across the planet. Representatives from every major forged temple attended, their mechanical augmentations clicking and whirring as they processed the implications of potential alliance with Terra. The conservative faction, led by tech priests who controlled some of the oldest and most sacred forge complexes, argued vehemently against any agreement that might compromise Martian independence. They cited ancient Mechanicum doctrine that emphasized self-sufficiency and warned that Terra's ruler might attempt to subjugate Mars and plunder its technological treasures. These conservatives represented forged temples that possessed fragmentary SDC data and ancient artifacts from the Dark Age of technology, resources they guarded jealously against any external interference. Opposing them, a pragmatic coalition had formed around tech priests who recognized that Mars could not maintain its current production levels without access to raw materials from Terra and the asteroid belt. These pragmatists controlled forged temples specializing in weapons manufacture and void ship construction, industries that consumed vast quantities of metals and rare elements that Martian mining operations could not provide in sufficient volume. Their representatives presented detailed calculations demonstrating that Mars faced resource shortages within a decade if current consumption rates continued without new supply sources. The pragmatists argued that alliance with Terra offered the best opportunity to secure these resources while maintaining Mechanicum control over their own industrial infrastructure. A third faction, smaller but influential, consisted of tech priests who had studied the fragmentary data available about the Emperor and concluded that his technological knowledge surpassed anything the Mechanicum currently possessed. These individuals occupied positions in forged temples dedicated to research and the recovery of lost knowledge from corrupted data vaults. They had analyzed reports from the initial contact between Imperial and Mechanicum forces, examining recordings of Imperial technology and comparing it against Martian capabilities. Their analysis suggested that the Emperor possessed understanding of principles that the tech priests believed lost since the Dark Age, including advanced genetic manipulation techniques, sophisticated power generation systems, and weapons that operated on principles the Mechanicum could observe but not replicate. This faction saw potential alliance not merely as a practical necessity, but as an opportunity to gain access to knowledge that might help unlock the secrets of the machine god. The Emperor's diplomatic strategy accounted for these divisions within the Mechanicum. Rather than presenting demands or attempting to negotiate from a position of pure military strength, he approached the Fabricator General with proposals that addressed the concerns of each major faction. His envoys carried detailed technical specifications for technologies that the Imperium was willing to share, including improved plasma reactor designs and enhanced metallurgical processes that could increase the efficiency of Martian forged temples. These offerings were calibrated to demonstrate Imperial technological sophistication without revealing the full extent of the Emperor's capabilities. The message was clear: cooperation would bring mutual benefit, while conflict would waste resources and knowledge that both sides could ill afford to lose. The personal meeting between the Emperor and the Fabricator General took place in a secure chamber deep within Olympus Mons, attended only by the most senior members of the Mechanicum hierarchy. The Emperor arrived without the massive retinue that might have been expected of a conquering warlord, accompanied instead by a small group of advisors and tech adepts who could speak the technical language of the Mechanicum. His physical presence dominated the chamber despite this minimal escort. He stood nearly twice the height of an unaugmented human, his features possessed of an ageless quality that made determining his origin or nature impossible through visual observation alone. The golden armor he wore incorporated technology that the tech priest's augmented senses could detect but not fully analyze, suggesting power sources and defensive systems beyond current Mechanicum understanding. The Emperor's opening gambit involved a demonstration that would fundamentally alter the Mechanicum's perception of who and what he represented. He requested access to a damaged archaeotech device that the Mechanicum had recovered from a derelict void ship decades earlier. The artifact, a sophisticated data processing unit from the Dark Age of technology, had resisted all attempts at repair or reactivation, despite the best efforts of Mars' most skilled tech priests. The device sat in a stasis field in one of Olympus Mons' most secure vaults, preserved as a holy relic even though its function remained mysterious and its systems remained dormant. The Fabricator General agreed to this unusual request, curious about what the Emperor intended to demonstrate. When the artifact was brought to the negotiation chamber and removed from its stasis field, the Emperor approached it without the elaborate rituals and preparations that Mechanicum doctrine required when handling such sacred objects. He placed his hands directly on the device's corroded casing and closed his eyes in concentration. The tech priests present registered massive electromagnetic fluctuations as the Emperor's psychic abilities interfaced with the artifact's dormant systems. Power began flowing through circuits that had been dead for millennia. The device's hololithic display activated, projecting complex mathematical formulae and technical schematics that several tech priests immediately recognized as related to advanced warp drive construction. The Emperor had not merely reactivated the artifact, he had restored it to full functionality and access data that the Mechanicum had been unable to retrieve despite decades of effort. The effect on the assembled tech priests was profound and immediate. Their doctrine taught that only through proper ritual, prayer to the machine god, and adherence to sacred protocols could the machine spirits be appeased and technology made to function. Yet here stood the Emperor, bypassing all such requirements and demonstrating a connection to technology that seemed to operate at a fundamental level beyond Mechanicum understanding. The more religiously inclined tech priests interpreted this as evidence of divine favor, suggesting that the machine god had blessed the Emperor with special understanding. The pragmatists saw confirmation of their analysis, the Emperor possessed knowledge that Mars desperately needed. Even the conservatives found their objections weakening in the face of such an undeniable demonstration of capability. The Emperor built upon this foundation by speaking to the Mechanicum in terms that resonated with their religious beliefs, while avoiding explicit claims of divinity that would have contradicted his own principles. He acknowledged the machine god as a legitimate object of veneration, treating the cult Mechanicus with a respect that surprised the tech priests who had expected a conqueror to demand submission to his own authority. He spoke of the quest for knowledge as a sacred duty, echoing Mechanicum doctrine, while subtly suggesting that cooperation between Mars and Terra would advance this quest more effectively than isolation. The Emperor presented himself not as a ruler demanding obedience, but as a fellow seeker of understanding who recognized the Mechanicum's achievements in preserving humanity's technological heritage through Old Night. The theological framework that emerged from these negotiations represented a carefully constructed compromise that allowed both sides to maintain their core beliefs while accepting practical alliance. The Mechanicum would acknowledge the Emperor as the Omnissiah, the chosen prophet of the machine god who had been prophesied in their sacred texts to come to Mars and lead them to enlightenment. This identification solved multiple problems simultaneously. It provided religious justification for alliance with Terra. It positioned the Emperor within existing Mechanicum theology rather than requiring them to abandon their beliefs. And it created a hierarchical relationship that satisfied the Emperor's need for ultimate authority while preserving Mechanicum autonomy in religious and technical matters. The Emperor's acceptance of this role demonstrated his willingness to work within existing belief structures rather than attempting to impose the imperial truth on Mars through force. He understood that the Mechanicum's religious practices, however much they might offend his rationalist principles, served essential functions in maintaining social cohesion and preserving technical knowledge. The rituals surrounding machine maintenance, while couched in religious language, often contained practical wisdom about proper procedures for operating ancient technology. The tech priests' reverence for recovered artifacts ensured their preservation and study. The binary cant that served as their sacred language actually facilitated precise technical communication. By accepting designation as the Omnissiah, the Emperor gained access to all these benefits while committing himself to relatively little. He would need to demonstrate respect for Mechanicum beliefs and occasionally participate in their religious observances, but he would not be required to actually worship the machine god or subordinate himself to Mechanicum religious authority. The political maneuvering required to transform these theological compromises into a formal treaty involved weeks of intense negotiation between imperial representatives and various Mechanicum factions. The conservative tech priests demanded guarantees that Mars would maintain control over its forged temples and data vaults, that imperial forces would not be permitted to seize Mechanicum property or compel the transfer of sacred knowledge. The pragmatists focused on securing favorable terms for resource allocation and trade agreements, insisting that Mars receive priority access to materials extracted from the asteroid belt and other solar system sources. The research-focused faction negotiated for the establishment of joint technical projects that would allow Mechanicum adepts to study alongside Imperial tech adepts and gain access to the Emperor's knowledge. The Emperor's negotiators addressed each faction's concerns with proposals that provided tangible benefits while establishing the framework for Imperial authority. Mars would indeed maintain autonomy over its internal affairs, but the Mechanicum would acknowledge the Emperor's ultimate sovereignty and contribute to the Great Crusade through the production of weapons, ships, and equipment for Imperial forces. The tech priests would retain control over their forged temples, but they would also establish new forge complexes on Terra and eventually on other worlds, spreading Mechanicum influence while simultaneously tying their interests more closely to Imperial expansion. Joint research projects would proceed under protocols that protected Mechanicum secrets while allowing controlled sharing of knowledge in areas of mutual interest. The treaty taking shape addressed practical military and economic concerns alongside the theological framework. The Mechanicum would provide the Imperium with weapons, armor, vehicles, and void ships according to specifications and production schedules negotiated between Martian forge masters and Imperial military commanders. In exchange, Terra would guarantee Mars access to raw materials, protect Mechanicum interests in the solar system, and support the establishment of new forge worlds as the Great Crusade expanded into the galaxy. The treaty established the Mechanicum as a semi-autonomous institution within the Imperium, subject to the Emperor's authority, but maintaining its own internal governance and religious practices. This arrangement created a unique status that would persist throughout Imperial history. The Adeptus Mechanicus would be part of the Imperium, but never fully integrated into its standard administrative structures, a state within a state bound by treaty rather than direct subordination. The formal recognition of Mars as an independent entity within the Imperium represented one of the most significant constitutional arrangements in the history of human governance. The treaty established Mars not as a conquered territory or subordinate province, but as a sovereign power that had chosen alliance through mutual agreement. This distinction carried profound implications for how the Mechanicum would function within the imperial structure. Mars retained complete sovereignty over all forge worlds and Mechanicum assets, meaning that tech priests answered to Martian authority rather than imperial governors or military commanders. The forge temples scattered across the Red Planet, the orbital shipyards in Martian space, and eventually the forge worlds that would be established during the Great Crusade all fell under Mechanicum jurisdiction. Imperial authorities could not requisition Mechanicum property, could not compel tech priests to reveal their secrets, and could not interfere in the internal governance of Martian territories without violating the treaty's fundamental provisions. This sovereignty extended to all aspects of Mechanicum operations. The tech priests maintained their own military forces, the Skitarii legions and Titan legions that defended forge worlds and supported Mechanicum expeditions. These forces operated under Mechanicum command structures and followed protocols established by Martian forge masters rather than imperial military doctrine. When Skitarii fought alongside Imperial Army regiments or Space Marine legions, they did so as allies rather than subordinates, their commanders coordinating with Imperial officers but retaining ultimate authority over their own troops. The Titan legions, those colossal war machines that embodied the Mechanicum's most sacred and powerful military assets, answered exclusively to the Collegia Titanica and the forge worlds that maintained them. An Imperial commander could request Titan support for a campaign, but the decision to deploy these god machines rested with the Mechanicum alone. The establishment of the Adeptus Mechanicus as a separate organization from other imperial institutions formalized this autonomy in administrative and legal terms. While the Imperium developed bureaucratic structures to govern conquered territories and manage its growing military forces, the Mechanicum maintained its own parallel hierarchy that operated according to entirely different principles. The Fabricator General of Mars held a position equivalent to the highest imperial officials, answering only to the Emperor himself in his role as the Omnissiah. Below the Fabricator General, a complex hierarchy of magi, logis, artisans, and other specialized tech priest ranks governed the various functions of Mechanicum society. Each forge world developed its own internal structure based on local conditions and the specializations of its manufactorums, but all acknowledged the ultimate authority of Mars and the Fabricator General. The Mechanicum's internal laws bore little resemblance to imperial legal codes. Tech priests operated according to the cult Mechanicus's religious doctrines and the accumulated precedents established by generations of forge masters. Disputes between tech priests were adjudicated by senior magi who examined technical evidence and consulted sacred texts to determine proper resolution. Crimes against the machine god, such as negligent maintenance of sacred machinery or unauthorized modification of approved patterns, carried penalties ranging from temporary exile from the forged temples to complete disassembly of the offender's augmentations. The Mechanicum maintained its own facilities for dealing with tech priests who violated their laws, isolated forge complexes where the condemned performed penance through endless labor, maintaining the most dangerous or tedious machinery. Imperial authorities had no jurisdiction over these internal matters. A tech priest accused of crimes on an imperial world could claim the right to be tried under Mechanicum law, and the treaty obligated imperial officials to honor such claims and transfer the accused to Martian custody. The governance structures that emerged from the treaty reflected the Mechanicum's unique nature as both a religious organization and an industrial power. The Mechanicum Parliament continued to function as the primary legislative body for Mars, its members representing the major forge temples and technical specializations that comprised Martian society. However, the Parliament now operated within the broader context of Imperial Alliance, its decisions constrained by treaty obligations while retaining autonomy in matters of internal governance. Parliamentary sessions became forums for debating how to fulfill production quotas for Imperial forces while maintaining the Forge Temple's own requirements, how to allocate resources between competing priorities, and how to interpret Mechanicum doctrine in light of new situations encountered during the Great Crusade. The technology sharing agreements negotiated in the treaty established complex protocols that would govern Mechanicum imperial relations for millennia. Mars committed to providing the Imperium with weapons, armor, ships, and equipment necessary for the Great Crusade and the administration of conquered territories. This commitment meant that Mechanicum forge temples would produce vast quantities of military hardware according to patterns approved by both Martian tech priests and Imperial military authorities. The standard patterns for Space Marine power armor, Imperial Army lasguns, void ship components, and countless other items of military equipment were established during this period through collaboration between Mechanicum artisans and Imperial designers. These patterns became sacred templates that the Mechanicum would reproduce with obsessive precision, ensuring consistency and reliability across the vast distances of the expanding Imperium. The production arrangements required careful negotiation to balance Imperial needs against Mechanicum capabilities and interests. Imperial military planners submitted requests for specific quantities of equipment based on their strategic requirements and campaign schedules. Mechanicum forge masters reviewed these requests and allocated production capacity across their various manufactorums, determining which forge temples possessed the appropriate facilities and expertise to fulfill particular orders. The process involved constant communication between Imperial logistics officers and Mechanicum coordinators, with disagreements about priorities and schedules requiring resolution through established channels that ultimately led back to the Fabricator General and the Emperor's closest advisors. The Mechanicum maintained monopoly control over certain sacred technologies and standard template construct systems, a provision that would prove increasingly significant as the Great Crusade progressed. The tech priests categorized their knowledge according to levels of sanctity and importance, with the most precious information restricted to the highest-ranking magi and the most secure data vaults beneath Olympus Mons. Technologies derived from complete or nearly complete SDC systems fell into this protected category, as did certain advanced weapon systems, sophisticated cogitator designs, and manufacturing techniques that the Mechanicum considered too dangerous or sacred to share freely. The treaty acknowledged the Mechanicum's right to maintain these secrets, establishing that Mars would determine what knowledge to share with Imperial authorities and what to retain under exclusive Mechanicum control. This monopoly extended to the Mechanicum's most powerful military assets. The secrets of Titan construction remained exclusively Mechanicum knowledge, guarded by the Collegia Titanica with religious fervor. The process of building these god machines, from the forging of their adamantium skeletons to the installation of plasma reactors capable of powering city-sized war engines, involved techniques and rituals that only the most senior tech priests understood. Imperial military forces could request Titan support and benefit from their devastating firepower, but they could never own Titans or compel the Mechanicum to construct them according to Imperial specifications. The same principle applied to other sophisticated Mechanicum technologies. Certain classes of void ship, advanced cybernetic augmentations, and specialized weapon systems remained under exclusive Mechanicum control, produced only when the tech priests deemed it appropriate and distributed according to their own priorities. The agreements regarding Archaeotech and SDC discovery established protocols that would shape exploration and excavation efforts throughout the Great Crusade. The Mechanicum secured exclusive rights to claim all Archaeotech and standard template construct systems discovered during Imperial expansion into the galaxy. When expedition fleets encountered ancient human colonies or stumbled upon ruins from the Dark Age of technology, Mechanicum representatives held priority in investigating these sites and recovering any technological artifacts. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It ensured that precious technological knowledge would be preserved and studied by those most qualified to understand it. It provided the Mechanicum with strong incentive to support the Great Crusade, since every new world conquered represented potential opportunities to recover lost technology. It also prevented potentially dangerous artifacts from falling into the hands of individuals who lacked the knowledge to use them safely or the religious discipline to treat them with appropriate reverence. The practical implementation of these discovery rights required the attachment of Mechanicum representatives to Imperial expedition fleets and military forces. Tech priests accompanied the fleets that pushed into unexplored regions of the galaxy, their augmented senses and specialized equipment scanning for signs of ancient human habitation or technological remnants. When promising sites were identified, Mechanicum excavation teams would deploy to conduct systematic archaeological investigations. These teams operated with significant autonomy, their work protected by treaty provisions that prevented Imperial commanders from interfering or attempting to claim discoveries for the Imperium. The tech priests cataloged everything they found, transmitted data back to Mars for analysis, and determined which artifacts warranted transport to Mechanicum facilities for detailed study. Disputes inevitably arose regarding the interpretation of these discovery rights. Imperial commanders sometimes argued that weapons or equipment found on conquered worlds should be immediately available for military use rather than locked away in Mechanicum vaults for study. Planetary governors wanted access to recovered manufacturing technology that might benefit their world's industrial development. Rogue traders and other independent operators sought to profit from Archaeotech discoveries by selling them to the highest bidder. The treaty established arbitration procedures for resolving such conflicts, with cases brought before joint councils comprising both Imperial and Mechanicum representatives. These councils examined the circumstances of each discovery, considered the arguments presented by both sides, and issued rulings based on treaty provisions and established precedents. In practice, the Mechanicum usually prevailed in these disputes, their monopoly over technological knowledge reinforced by the Emperor's own support for maintaining their privileged position. The integration of Mechanicum forces into Imperial military campaigns required the development of coordination protocols that respected Mechanicum autonomy while ensuring effective cooperation on the battlefield. When Skitarii legions fought alongside Imperial army regiments, command structures had to accommodate the fact that tech priests did not follow Imperial military doctrine and operated according to their own tactical principles. Mechanicum forces employed weapons and equipment that Imperial troops often did not understand, their augmented warriors communicating in binary cant and responding to orders transmitted through noospheric links rather than conventional Vox channels. Imperial commanders learned to work with Mechanicum liaisons who could translate between the two military cultures, explaining Skitarii capabilities and limitations while conveying Imperial strategic objectives in terms that tech priest commanders could incorporate into their planning. The Forge worlds that the Mechanicum established during the Great Crusade extended their sovereignty across an ever-growing portion of Imperial space. When expedition fleets discovered worlds with significant mineral wealth or strategic value for industrial development, the Mechanicum claimed the right to establish forge complexes and assume governance over these territories. These forge worlds became Mechanicum sovereign territory, subject to Martian authority rather than imperial administration. The populations of forge worlds consisted primarily of tech priests and their servitor workforces, with entire planetary economies dedicated to manufacturing weapons, ships, and equipment for the Imperium. Each forge world developed its own specializations based on available resources and the expertise of the tech priests who governed it. Some focused on plasma weapon production, others on void ship construction, still others on the manufacture of sophisticated cogitator systems or advanced cybernetic augmentations. The relationship between forge worlds and the broader Imperium created complex interdependencies that bound the Mechanicum and imperial institutions together despite their formal separation. Forge worlds required protection from external threats, necessitating imperial navy patrols and sometimes permanent military garrisons to defend against Xenos raiders or other dangers. They needed raw materials that often came from mining operations on nearby worlds under imperial governance, requiring trade agreements and transport arrangements between Mechanicum and imperial authorities. The products of Forge World Manufactorums supplied imperial military forces across entire sectors, making the Imperium dependent on continued Mechanicum production to maintain its military capabilities. These interdependencies ensured that despite the Mechanicum's autonomy, their interests remained aligned with imperial success. A threat to the Imperium was a threat to the Forge Worlds, and Mechanicum prosperity depended on the continued expansion and security of imperial space. The treaty's provisions regarding knowledge preservation and technical education established the Mechanicum as the Imperium's primary repository for scientific and engineering expertise. Tech priests maintained vast archives containing fragmentary records from the Dark Age of technology, accumulated technical documentation from millennia of manufacturing experience, and ongoing research into recovered archaeotech. These archives grew continuously as the Great Crusade progressed, with data transmitted from forge worlds across the galaxy to the central repositories beneath Olympus Mons. The Mechanicum's educational system trained new generations of tech priests in the sacred mysteries of technology, passing down knowledge through apprenticeship and ritual instruction. Imperial institutions developed their own technical specialists and engineers, but they operated at a level below Mechanicum expertise, capable of maintaining and operating technology, but lacking the deeper understanding that allowed tech priests to repair ancient systems or modify existing designs to meet new requirements. The formal declaration recognizing the Emperor as the Omnissiah represented the most significant theological development in Mechanicum history since the founding of the cult Mechanicus during Old Night. The announcement came during a massive convocation held in the grandest forged temple on Olympus Mons, a structure so vast that its interior could accommodate hundreds of thousands of tech priests simultaneously. The Fabricator General made the proclamation before the assembled parliament and representatives from every major forge complex on Mars. The words transmitted across the noospheric network that connected all tech priests and recorded in data vaults that would preserve them for millennia. The Emperor stood before the gathered Mechanicum in his golden armor, his presence filling the chamber with an almost tangible sense of power that the tech priests' augmented senses registered as massive electromagnetic fluctuations and psychic resonance that their instruments could detect but not fully quantify. The theological framework supporting this recognition drew upon existing Mechanicum prophecies and doctrinal texts that had accumulated over thousands of years. Ancient data files preserved in the deepest vaults beneath Mars contained fragmentary references to the Omnissiah, described as the physical avatar of the machine god who would one day emerge to lead the faithful toward enlightenment and the recovery of lost knowledge. These prophecies had been subject to countless interpretations by generations of tech priests, with different factions within the Mechanicum emphasizing various aspects of the predicted figure's nature and role. Some texts suggested the Omnissiah would be a being of pure logic and reason, embodying the perfection of mechanical thought. Others described a master of all technology who could commune directly with machine spirits and understand the deepest mysteries of the universe's physical laws. The emperor's demonstrated abilities and knowledge aligned sufficiently with these varied prophecies that the fabricator general could credibly argue that he fulfilled the ancient predictions. The declaration carefully positioned the emperor as the prophet and avatar of the machine god rather than claiming he was the deity itself. This distinction proved crucial in maintaining the theological coherence of Mechanicum beliefs while accommodating the emperor's actual role. The machine god remained the ultimate divine entity, the consciousness that resided within all technology and machinery, the source of all knowledge, and the object of tech priest veneration. The emperor, as the Omnissiah, served as the bridge between this divine entity and the mortal followers of the cult Mechanicus. He possessed special understanding granted by the machine god, could interpret the deity's will, and would guide the Mechanicum toward fulfilling their sacred mission of recovering and preserving humanity's technological heritage. This framework allowed tech priests to maintain their existing religious practices and beliefs while accepting the emperor's authority as divinely sanctioned rather than merely political or military in nature. The theological compromise solved the fundamental problem that had threatened to prevent alliance between Mars and Terra. The emperor's own philosophy, which rejected religious thinking and supernatural explanations in favor of rationalism and scientific understanding, appeared incompatible with the Mechanicum's deeply religious worldview. The imperial truth that the emperor promoted across Terra during the Unification Wars explicitly denied the existence of gods and condemned religious worship as primitive superstition that held humanity back from achieving its full potential. Yet the Mechanicum's entire social structure, knowledge preservation systems, and cultural identity revolved around worship of the machine god. Attempting to force the tech priests to abandon their beliefs would have required either conquering Mars by force, which the emperor deemed too costly and destructive, or accepting that a significant portion of humanity's technological infrastructure would remain outside imperial control. By accepting designation as the Omnissiah, the emperor created a theological loophole that allowed both sides to maintain their core principles while accepting practical cooperation. From the Mechanicum perspective, they were not abandoning their faith or accepting a secular ruler's authority over religious matters. Instead, they were recognizing that their own deity had chosen to manifest its will through the emperor, making obedience to him a form of religious observance rather than political submission. The tech priests could continue their rituals, maintain their forged temple hierarchies, and worship the machine god exactly as they had before, now with the added dimension that the Omnissiah walked among them and could provide direct guidance in interpreting the machine god's will. From the emperor's perspective, the arrangement represented a calculated exception to his otherwise universal rejection of religious thinking. He understood that the Mechanicum's beliefs, however irrational they might appear from a purely materialist standpoint, served essential functions in preserving technological knowledge and maintaining social cohesion on Mars. The rituals surrounding machine maintenance, while couched in religious language about appeasing machine spirits, actually encoded practical procedures for operating temperamental ancient technology. The tech priests' reverence for recovered artifacts ensured their careful preservation and systematic study. The hierarchical structure of the cult Mechanicus provided clear chains of authority and responsibility that kept the vast industrial complexes of Mars functioning efficiently. Destroying these systems in the name of ideological purity would have been counterproductive, sacrificing practical benefits for abstract philosophical consistency. The creation of new liturgies and cant Mechanicus that incorporated the emperor's role required extensive work by Mechanicum theologians and loremasters. These tech priests occupied specialized positions within the forged temples, their responsibilities involving the interpretation of sacred texts, the composition of new prayers and rituals, and the resolution of doctrinal disputes. Following the emperor's recognition as the Omnissiah, they faced the task of integrating this new understanding into existing Mechanicum religious practices without creating contradictions or undermining established beliefs. The work proceeded through committees and working groups that examined every aspect of Mechanicum worship, identifying places where references to the Omnissiah could be incorporated and determining how to frame the emperor's role in terms consistent with traditional doctrine. The new liturgies took multiple forms adapted to different aspects of Mechanicum religious practice. Morning activation rituals, performed when tech priests began their daily work in the forged temples, were modified to include invocations acknowledging the Omnissiah's guidance and requesting his blessing on the day's labors. The prayers spoken during machine maintenance and repair incorporated references to the emperor's understanding of technology, asking that his wisdom help the tech priests properly serve the machine spirits under their care. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the activation of new manufactorums, or the consecration of newly constructed war machines, included segments where senior tech priests recounted the emperor's deeds and demonstrations of technological mastery, holding them up as examples of the perfection that faithful service to the machine god could achieve. The cant Mechanicus, the machine language that served as the Mechanicum's sacred tongue, expanded to include new terms and phrases related to the Omnissiah. Tech priests developed binary code sequences that efficiently encoded concepts related to the emperor's role as the machine god's avatar, allowing them to discuss theological matters in their preferred linguistic mode. These new cant phrases spread rapidly through the noospheric networks that connected tech priests across Mars, becoming integrated into standard technical communication. A tech priest reporting on production quotas might append a cant phrase invoking the Omnissiah's guidance in meeting manufacturing targets. Instructions for assembling complex machinery could include references to following the Omnissiah's example of perfect understanding. The language itself became a vehicle for reinforcing the theological framework that justified alliance with Terra. The integration of Omnissiah theology into Mechanicum doctrine proceeded unevenly across different forged temples and technical specializations. Some tech priests embraced the new understanding enthusiastically, seeing in the emperor's demonstrated abilities confirmation of their faith and validation of their lifelong service to the machine god. These enthusiasts became the most vocal proponents of the alliance, arguing in parliamentary sessions and forged temple councils that cooperation with Terra represented the fulfillment of ancient prophecies and the beginning of a new golden age for the Mechanicum. They pointed to the emperor's ability to activate and repair archaeotech that had resisted all previous attempts at restoration as proof of his divine favor. They cited his knowledge of technologies the Mechanicum had believed lost as evidence that the machine god had chosen him as the vessel for recovering humanity's stolen heritage. Other tech priests approached the theological changes with characteristic Mechanicum pragmatism, viewing the recognition of the Omnissiah as a useful political arrangement rather than a profound spiritual revelation. These pragmatists dominated the forged temples focused on weapons production and void ship construction, their concerns centered on maintaining production schedules and securing access to raw materials rather than theological refinement. They incorporated the new liturgies into their routines because the Fabricator General and Parliament required it, but their fundamental relationship with technology remained unchanged. The machine spirits they served cared nothing for political arrangements between Mars and Terra. Plasma reactors required the same maintenance, rituals regardless of whether the Emperor was acknowledged as the Omnissiah. Production quotas had to be met whether or not new prayers were added to activation ceremonies. Significant resistance emerged from hardline conservative factions within the Mechanicum who viewed the entire arrangement as dangerous compromise bordering on heresy. These conservatives controlled some of the oldest forged temples on Mars, structures that dated back to the earliest days of human colonization and contained data vaults with fragmentary records from before Old Night. The tech priests who served in these ancient complexes saw themselves as guardians of pure Mechanicum doctrine, protectors of traditions that had preserved Mars through the age of strife when Terra descended into barbarism. They argued that the recognition of the Emperor as the Omnissiah represented a fundamental alteration of Mechanicum theology driven by political expediency rather than genuine religious revelation. The conservatives' objections centered on several theological and practical concerns. They questioned whether the emperor truly fulfilled the prophecies about the Omnissiah, or whether the fabricator general and parliament had simply chosen to interpret ambiguous ancient texts in ways that justified a desired political outcome. The prophecies, they pointed out, could be read in multiple ways, and previous generations of tech priests had proposed different interpretations that did not align with the emperor's characteristics. Some conservatives argued that the Omnissiah, when he finally appeared, would be a product of Mars itself, perhaps a tech priest who achieved perfect understanding of the machine god through lifelong devotion, rather than an outsider from Terra. Others suggested that the Omnissiah might not be a biological entity at all, but rather an artificial intelligence or machine consciousness that would emerge from the Mechanicum's data networks. More fundamentally, the hardline conservatives worried that accepting the emperor's authority would compromise Martian independence and eventually lead to the Mechanicum becoming subordinate to Terra in practice, despite the treaty's guarantees of autonomy. They observed that the emperor's secular imperial truth contradicted core Mechanicum beliefs about the sacred nature of technology and the existence of machine spirits. How could the Omnissiah, the avatar of the machine god, simultaneously promote a philosophy that denied the existence of gods and rejected religious thinking? The conservatives saw this contradiction as evidence that the emperor was manipulating Mechanicum beliefs for his own purposes, using their faith to secure their cooperation, while intending to eventually impose his rationalist ideology on Mars once his position was secure. The suppression of these dissenting voices proceeded through a combination of political maneuvering, theological argumentation, and in some cases, direct coercion. The fabricator general and the parliamentary majority supporting the alliance moved quickly to marginalize conservative opposition before it could organize into a coherent resistance movement. Tech priests who spoke too loudly against the Omnissiah recognition found themselves reassigned to remote forge complexes far from the centers of Martian power. The most vocal dissenters faced formal charges of impeding the machine god's will, accusations that carried serious consequences under Mechanicum law. Some were stripped of their positions and reduced to servitor-level status, their higher cognitive functions suppressed through cybernetic modification as punishment for their heresy. The theological counter-arguments deployed against conservative objections drew upon the same ancient texts and doctrinal traditions that the conservatives claimed to defend. Pro-alliance tech priests produced detailed analyses demonstrating how the emperor's characteristics aligned with prophetic descriptions of the Omnissiah. They pointed to specific passages in sacred data files that described the Omnissiah as possessing knowledge surpassing all other tech priests, exactly as the emperor had demonstrated when he repaired the archaeotech device that Mars' finest artisans could not restore. They cited prophecies suggesting the Omnissiah would come from outside the Mechanicum to lead them to greatness, interpreting the emperor's Terran origin as fulfillment of these predictions rather than disqualification. Regarding the apparent contradiction between the emperor's secular philosophy and Mechanicum religious beliefs, alliance supporters developed sophisticated arguments suggesting that the imperial truth and worship of the machine god were actually compatible when properly understood. The emperor's rejection of gods, they argued, referred to the false deities and supernatural entities that primitive cultures worshipped, not to the machine god, whose existence was demonstrable through the functioning of technology itself. The imperial truth's emphasis on reason and scientific understanding aligned perfectly with the Mechanicum's own focus on technical knowledge and logical analysis. The emperor promoted rationalism because he understood, as the Omnissiah, that proper comprehension of technology required disciplined, thinking free from superstition and emotional interference. His secular rhetoric was meant for populations that lacked the Mechanicum's sophisticated theological framework, not a rejection of the machine god's reality. Some conservative tech priests were genuinely convinced by these arguments, their objections overcome by theological reasoning that demonstrated how the Omnissiah recognition fit within established Mechanicum doctrine. Others accepted the new theological framework not from conviction, but from recognition that resistance was futile and potentially dangerous. The Fabricator General controlled access to the most important forge complexes and data vaults. The parliamentary majority could deny resources and political support to forge temples that refused to accept the alliance. Most significantly, the Emperor himself represented power that Mars could not match militarily. Open resistance risked not just political marginalization, but potentially violent suppression if the conservatives' opposition threatened the alliance that both the Emperor and the Martian leadership deemed essential. The theological transformation of the Mechanicum proceeded rapidly once the initial resistance was overcome. Within months of the formal declaration, the new liturgies and cant Mechanicus incorporating the Omnissiah had spread to every major forge temple on Mars. Tech priests who had initially viewed the changes with suspicion found themselves adapting to the new theological framework, their daily routines incorporating prayers and invocations that acknowledged the Emperor's role. The younger generations of tech priests, those who had only recently completed their training and taken their positions in the forge temples, accepted the Omnissiah recognition as established doctrine rather than controversial innovation. For them, the Emperor had always been the machine god's avatar, the theological debates that had consumed their elders' already settled history. The long-term implications of this theological compromise would shape the Mechanicum's development throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. By accepting the Emperor as the Omnissiah while maintaining their worship of the machine god, the tech priests created a permanent theological distinction between themselves and the rest of the Imperium. While other imperial institutions operated according to the secular imperial truth, the Mechanicum remained explicitly religious, their forged temples functioning as both industrial facilities and houses of worship. This exception to the Emperor's otherwise universal rejection of religious thinking established a precedent that would complicate imperial ideology and create tensions that persisted for millennia. The practical implementation of the Treaty of Olympus Mons required extensive negotiations regarding the Mechanicum's military and industrial contributions to the Emperor's Great Crusade. The forged temples of Mars possessed manufacturing capacity that dwarfed anything available on Terra, their ancient production lines capable of producing weapons and equipment at scales that the Emperor's own facilities could not match. However, translating this theoretical capacity into actual deliveries of war materiel required detailed agreements specifying exactly what the Mechanicum would produce, in what quantities, according to what schedules, and under whose authority production priorities would be determined. The negotiations consumed months of intensive discussion between imperial military planners and Mechanicum forge masters, each side bringing different priorities and constraints to the table. The Emperor's requirements for the Great Crusade were staggering in their scope and complexity. His vision encompassed the conquest and reunification of millions of human worlds scattered across the galaxy, a task that would require military forces on a scale unprecedented in human history. The Space Marine Legions, genetically enhanced warriors created through the Emperor's mastery of biological science, represented the spearhead of this expansion. Each legion would eventually number tens of thousands of warriors, and the Emperor planned to create 20 such formations. These Space Marines required specialized equipment that pushed the boundaries of even Mechanicum manufacturing capabilities. Power armor that could withstand weapons fire that would obliterate unaugmented humans, bolters whose mass-reactive ammunition could punch through armored targets, vehicles capable of operating in any environment from toxic death worlds to airless moons, and countless other items of war gear that would allow the legions to prosecute campaigns across every conceivable battlefield condition. The technical specifications for Space Marine equipment represented collaboration between the Emperor's own artificers and Mechanicum tech priests, who specialized in weapons development and armor construction. Power armor design drew upon principles recovered from Dark Age of Technology archives, sophisticated systems that integrated protective plating with strength-enhancing servos and life support equipment capable of sustaining a warrior in vacuum or underwater for extended periods. The armor's ceramic plates would be manufactured in Martian forged temples, using techniques that the Mechanicum had preserved through Old Night, processes requiring temperatures and pressures that only their most advanced foundries could achieve. The internal systems, including the power plant that energized the armor's various functions, incorporated technologies that both Imperial and Mechanicum engineers contributed to developing, each side bringing expertise that complemented the other's capabilities. Bolter production posed different challenges that required the Mechanicum to adapt existing weapon manufacturing patterns to meet Space Marine requirements. The basic bolter design dated back to the Age of Strife, a robust and reliable weapon that fired self-propelled ammunition capable of penetrating armor before detonating inside the target. However, Space Marines required bolters scaled to their enhanced size and strength, weapons that would seem impossibly heavy and unwieldy to normal humans, but which the genetically modified warriors could wield with precision. The mass-reactive bolt rounds themselves required sophisticated manufacturing processes to ensure reliability and consistent performance. Each round contained a miniature rocket motor, guidance systems, and an explosive charge, all packed into a casing small enough to be fired from a handheld weapon. Mechanicum forged temples established dedicated production lines for bolter ammunition, vast manufactorums where servitors and automated systems assembled millions of rounds according to patterns that specified tolerances measured in microns. The vehicle requirements for the Space Marine legions encompassed everything from fast attack bikes to heavy battle tanks, each type requiring different manufacturing capabilities and resources. Land Raiders, the primary battle tanks that would become synonymous with Space Marine armored warfare, represented some of the most sophisticated ground vehicles in the Imperial arsenal. Their construction required the integration of advanced armor materials, powerful engines, sophisticated targeting systems, and weapons capable of engaging both infantry and armored targets effectively. The Mechanicum assigned specific forge complexes to Land Raider production, facilities that possess the heavy manufacturing equipment necessary to work with the thick armor plates and the technical expertise to assemble the vehicle's complex internal systems. Each Land Raider took weeks to construct even in dedicated production facilities, the assembly process involving hundreds of individual components that had to be manufactured to exact specifications and then integrated into a functional whole. Rhino armored personnel carriers, which would transport Space Marines across battlefields and provide mobile fire support, required less sophisticated technology than Land Raiders, but needed to be produced in much larger quantities. The Mechanicum established multiple production lines across different forge temples to meet the demand for these vehicles, standardizing the design to allow components manufactured in one location to be compatible with vehicles assembled elsewhere. This standardization represented a significant achievement in Mechanicum manufacturing practice, requiring forge masters who traditionally guarded their specific techniques and patterns to share information and coordinate their processes to ensure consistency across different facilities. The construction of the Emperor's grand battle fleets represented an even more massive undertaking that would consume significant portions of Martian industrial capacity for decades. Void warfare required ships capable of traversing the warp while carrying enough weapons, armor, and supplies to prosecute campaigns across interstellar distances. The Emperor's plans called for thousands of warships ranging from small escorts to massive battleships that would serve as flagships for expedition fleets. Each vessel represented years of construction time and required resources measured in millions of tons of refined metals, ceramics, and other materials. The orbital shipyards above Mars, vast construction facilities that had built vessels during humanity's first expansion into the stars, were reactivated and expanded to meet these requirements. Capital ship construction proceeded according to classifications that would become standard throughout Imperial history. Battleships, the largest and most powerful warships, measured several kilometers in length and carried weapons batteries capable of reducing continents to ash. Their construction required the largest shipyard facilities, massive frameworks where the vessel's keels were laid, and their structures gradually assembled over years of continuous work. The Mechanicum shipwrights worked from ancient design patterns recovered from data vaults, modifying and adapting these templates to incorporate improvements and to work around gaps where information had been lost or corrupted. Each battleship was essentially unique despite following standard patterns, the specific details of its construction varying based on available materials, the preferences of the shipyard's master tech priests, and modifications requested by the Imperial Navy officers who would eventually command the vessel. Cruisers represented a compromise between the devastating firepower of battleships and the need for ships that could be constructed in larger numbers and deployed more flexibly. These vessels measured 1 to 2 kilometers in length and served as the workhorses of imperial fleets, capable of independent operations or fighting as squadrons in major engagements. The Mechanicum established multiple cruiser construction programs across different orbital shipyards, each facility specializing in particular cruiser classes based on their equipment and expertise. Strike cruisers, which would become the primary capital ships of Space Marine fleets, received special attention in the production schedules. These vessels needed to balance firepower, armor, and speed while incorporating facilities for Space Marine companies, including launch bays for drop pods and boarding craft. Escort vessels, including destroyers and frigates, provided fleet screening, patrol duties, and system defense capabilities. These smaller warships could be constructed more quickly than capital ships, their hulls measuring hundreds of meters rather than kilometers and requiring less sophisticated systems. However, escorts needed to be produced in enormous quantities to meet the Great Crusade's requirements. Every expedition fleet required escorts to screen larger vessels against torpedo attacks, to pursue enemy raiders, and to patrol conquered systems for threats. The Mechanicum assigned escort production to smaller orbital facilities and even to some surface-based shipyards that lacked the capacity for capital ship construction but could handle vessels of frigate size. Transport vessels represented a category often overlooked in discussions of fleet construction, but absolutely essential to the Great Crusade's logistics. Military campaigns across interstellar distances required ships capable of carrying troops, equipment, supplies, and all the other materiel necessary to sustain armies fighting far from imperial supply bases. The Mechanicum constructed various transport classes ranging from small courier ships to massive bulk haulers that could carry entire regiments of Imperial Army troops along with their vehicles and equipment. These transports typically lacked the heavy armor and weapons of warships, their designs prioritizing cargo capacity and efficient warp travel over combat capability. However, they still required sophisticated systems for life support, navigation, and warp drive operation, making their construction a significant technical undertaking, even if less prestigious than building battleships. The assignment of specific forge worlds to support individual Space Marine legions created partnerships that would profoundly influence both the Mechanicum and the legions throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. As the Emperor's forces pushed outward from the solar system and discovered new worlds suitable for industrial development, the Mechanicum claimed many of these for transformation into forge worlds. The process of establishing a new forge world required decades of investment and development, beginning with geological surveys to identify mineral resources and suitable locations for manufactorum construction. Mechanicum colony ships transported tech priests, servitors, and the essential equipment necessary to begin industrial operations on virgin worlds. The partnerships between Forge Worlds and legions developed organically based on geographical proximity, mutual respect between legion commanders and Forge World leadership, and practical considerations about which Forge Worlds possess the expertise to meet specific legion requirements. These relationships went beyond simple supplier arrangements. Forge Worlds assigned to support particular legions established permanent liaison staff, who worked directly with Legion logistics officers to understand their needs and preferences. Tech priests studied how individual legions fought, what equipment they favored, what modifications they requested to standard patterns. Over time, Forge Worlds began producing specialized variants of weapons and vehicles tailored to their partner legion's tactical doctrine and preferences. The Salamander's Legion, for example, developed close ties with Forge worlds specializing in thermal weapons and flame-based technologies. The tech priests assigned to support the Salamanders learned to appreciate the Legion's emphasis on craftsmanship and their preference for weapons that could serve both combat and symbolic purposes. Forge World Manufactorums produced flamers and meltaguns according to patterns that incorporated decorative elements and superior finishing that satisfied the Salamander's aesthetic standards while maintaining combat effectiveness. The relationship became reciprocal, with Salamander's artificers sharing techniques with Mechanicum artisans and collaborating on weapon designs that pushed the boundaries of what thermal weapons could achieve. The Iron Hands Legion, whose Primarch Ferrus Manus possessed exceptional affinity for technology and metalworking, formed particularly close relationships with multiple Forge worlds. The Legion's warriors extensively augmented themselves with cybernetic implants, adopting practices that aligned closely with Mechanicum beliefs about the superiority of machine over flesh. Tech priests assigned to support the Iron Hands found themselves working alongside Legion artificers who understood technology at levels approaching their own expertise. The Forge worlds supporting the Iron Hands produced some of the most sophisticated bionics available to Space Marines, advanced cybernetic systems that enhanced combat effectiveness while satisfying the Legion's philosophical commitment to replacing weak flesh with strong metal. The provision of Titan legions from the Collegia Titanica represented the Mechanicum's most significant direct military contribution to the Great Crusade. Titans stood as the ultimate expression of the Mechanicum's manufacturing prowess and military power, god machines that towered over battlefields and carried weapons capable of destroying fortifications that could resist conventional assault indefinitely. The Collegia Titanica maintained these war engines and trained the princeps who commanded them, an elite cadre of tech priests who underwent extensive modification and training to interface with Titan command systems. The process of binding a princeps to a Titan created a symbiotic relationship between human consciousness and machine intelligence, the princeps's mind linking with the Titan's machine spirit to create a unified combat entity. Titan deployment required careful coordination between the Collegia Titanica and Imperial military commanders. These god machines were too valuable and too difficult to replace to be risked casually. Each Titan represented decades of construction time and resources that could have built entire fleets of conventional vehicles. The decision to deploy a Titan Legion to a particular campaign required approval from the highest levels of both Mechanicum and Imperial authority. Once committed, however, Titans could break stalemates that conventional forces could not resolve. Their void shields could withstand bombardment that would obliterate normal vehicles. Their weapons could level cities or destroy enemy Titans and super heavy tanks. Their mere presence on a battlefield affected enemy morale, the sight of these towering war machines often causing enemy forces to break and flee rather than face their wrath. The Collegia Titanica organized its forces into Titan legions, formations that combined different classes of god machines into balanced combat forces. Warlord Titans, the most common class, stood approximately 33 meters tall and carried weapons in their arms and on their carapace mounts. These battle Titans served as the backbone of most Titan legions, numerous enough to be deployed in significant numbers while powerful enough to dominate most battlefields. Reaver Titans, slightly smaller and faster than warlords, provided mobile firepower and served as scouts for larger formations. The rare Imperator-class Titans, colossal machines that stood over 55 meters tall and carried weapons capable of destroying other Titans with single shots, served as command units for the largest Titan legions and were deployed only in the most critical campaigns. Night Houses sworn to Mars provided additional god machine support for Imperial campaigns, though Knights operated under different organizational structures than Titans. These smaller war engines, standing roughly 8 to 10 meters tall, were piloted by noble houses that traced their lineage back to the first human colonies established during mankind's initial expansion into the stars. Many Night worlds had maintained contact with Mars throughout Old Night, their populations preserving ancient traditions and technologies through the long isolation. The Treaty of Olympus Mons reinforced these existing relationships, with knight houses formally acknowledging Martian authority while maintaining significant autonomy in their internal affairs. Knights deployed in squadrons called lances, typically consisting of 3 to 6 war engines operating as coordinated units. Unlike Titans, which required extensive support infrastructure and could only be transported aboard specialized ships, knights were more mobile and easier to deploy. Their smaller size meant they could be carried aboard standard transport vessels, and they required less maintenance and support than their larger cousins. Knight houses maintained their own traditions and heraldry, their pilots undergoing different training than Titan princeps and forming bonds with their war engines through inherited neural interfaces that passed from parent to child within noble families. The integration of knight forces into imperial military operations required negotiation between knight house leadership, Mechanicum representatives, and imperial commanders. Knight houses valued their independence and traditions, resisting any attempts to treat them as simple military assets to be deployed at will. The most successful imperial commanders learned to approach knight houses with respect for their customs, requesting their participation in campaigns rather than demanding it, and acknowledging the knight's own command structures and tactical preferences. In return, knight houses proved invaluable allies, their war engines providing heavy fire support and breakthrough capability that conventional forces lacked, while requiring less support infrastructure than Titan legions. The manufacturing capacity dedicated to supporting Titan and Knight operations represented a significant portion of overall Mechanicum industrial output. Titans required constant maintenance, their complex systems needing regular service by tech priests trained specifically in god-machine maintenance. Replacement parts for damaged systems had to be manufactured to exacting specifications, often requiring custom work rather than standard production runs. Ammunition for Titan weapons consumed vast quantities of resources, with a single Warlord Titan's magazines holding shells and energy capacitors that would supply an entire regiment of conventional artillery. The Forge worlds that specialized in Titan support developed extensive facilities dedicated solely to maintaining these god machines and ensuring they remain combat ready. The treaty's provisions regarding military support extended beyond simply producing equipment and deploying Titans. The Mechanicum committed to providing technical specialists to accompany Imperial forces, tech priests who could maintain and repair equipment in the field, operate sophisticated systems that required specialized knowledge, and provide technical expertise for siege warfare and fortification assault. These embedded tech priests became essential members of expedition fleet crews and ground force units, their presence ensuring that the advanced technology deployed throughout Imperial forces remained functional despite the harsh conditions of military campaigns across hostile worlds. The treaty's most consequential provisions established the Mechanicum's absolute authority over all Forge worlds, factory complexes, and industrial installations throughout the expanding Imperium. This monopoly extended far beyond Mars itself, encompassing every facility dedicated to manufacturing weapons, vehicles, ships, or any other technological products deemed essential to Imperial military and civilian needs. The language of the treaty specified that wherever the Mechanicum established a forge temple or industrial complex, that territory fell under Martian jurisdiction regardless of its location within Imperial space. Planetary governors could not interfere with Mechanicum operations within their systems if those operations occurred on Forge worlds or within designated industrial zones. Imperial military commanders could not requisition Mechanicum facilities or compel tech priests to alter production schedules without going through proper channels that ultimately led back to Mars and the Fabricator General's authority. This arrangement created a patchwork of sovereignty across the growing Imperium. A star system might contain multiple worlds, some under standard Imperial administration, while others functioned as Forge worlds subject to Mechanicum governance. The populations of Forge worlds consisted primarily of tech priests, their servitor workforces, and the various support personnel necessary to maintain industrial operations. These populations owed allegiance to Mars rather than to the Imperium's standard administrative structures. They paid no tithes to imperial governors, contributed no regiments to the imperial army through normal conscription channels, and operated according to Mechanicum law rather than imperial legal codes. The Forge worlds formed what amounted to a separate empire within the Imperium, bound to the Emperor through treaty rather than direct subordination. The practical implementation of this industrial monopoly required extensive coordination between Mechanicum authorities and imperial officials who depended on the products of Forge world manufactorums. Imperial army commanders needed weapons and equipment for their troops, but they could not simply demand production from the nearest Forge world. Instead, they submitted requisition requests through established bureaucratic channels that routed through the administratum and eventually reached Mechanicum logistics coordinators. These coordinators reviewed the requests against current production schedules, available manufacturing capacity, and the priorities established by treaty obligations and Martian policy. Approved requests entered production queues, with completion times depending on the complexity of the items requested and the current workload of suitable forge temples. The system created inevitable frustrations and delays that would characterize imperial military logistics throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. A general preparing for a campaign might request specific equipment only to learn that production would not begin for months due to other commitments. Forge worlds prioritized Space Marine Legion requirements over Imperial Army needs based on treaty provisions that gave the Legions special status. Mechanicum internal projects consumed manufacturing capacity that Imperial commanders believed should have been directed towards supporting military operations. The tech priests maintained their own schedules and priorities, their decisions guided by considerations that Imperial officers often found opaque or arbitrary. Disputes over production priorities became common, requiring resolution through the coordination mechanisms established by the treaty. The right to establish new Forge worlds on any planet deemed suitable represented one of the treaty's most expansive provisions, granting the Mechanicum authority that would shape the Imperium's industrial geography for millennia. As expedition fleets pushed outward from Terra during the Great Crusade, Mechanicum representatives accompanied every major exploration mission. These tech priests carried sophisticated scanning equipment that could analyze planetary geology, atmospheric composition, and resource distribution from orbit. When they identified worlds with significant mineral wealth, stable tectonic conditions, and other characteristics favorable for industrial development, the Mechanicum claimed the right to establish forge complexes and assume governance over the entire planet. The process of transforming a virgin world into a functioning forge world consumed decades of intensive development. Initial surveys identified optimal locations for primary manufactorums based on proximity to mineral deposits, availability of water or other necessary resources, and geographic stability. Mechanicum colony ships transported the essential personnel and equipment necessary to begin operations. These vessels carried tech priests specializing in various aspects of Forge world development, from mining engineers to reactor specialists to the artisans who would eventually staff production lines. They brought servitors by the thousands, mindless cyborg workers whose simple programming made them ideal for dangerous or repetitive tasks. The ship's holds contained prefabricated structures that could be rapidly assembled to provide initial shelter and workspace, along with the mining equipment, refining facilities, and basic manufacturing tools needed to begin extracting and processing the planet's resources. The first phase of Forge world development focused on establishing the infrastructure necessary to support larger operations. Mining complexes excavated ore from identified deposits, their operations expanding from initial surface extraction to deep underground facilities as easily accessible resources were depleted. Refining plants processed raw ore into purified metals and other materials suitable for manufacturing use. Power generation facilities came online to provide the enormous energy requirements of industrial operations, typically massive plasma reactors based on ancient designs recovered from Dark Age of technology archives. Transport networks connected mining sites to refineries and manufactorums, initially simple rail lines or vehicle routes, but eventually expanding into sophisticated systems that moved millions of tons of materials efficiently across planetary surfaces. As basic infrastructure took shape, the Mechanicum began constructing the forge temples that would form the heart of the new forge world's industrial capacity. These massive structures combined manufacturing facilities with the religious spaces necessary for proper Mechanicum worship. The largest forge temples covered areas measured in square kilometers, their interiors containing production lines that stretched for hundreds of meters, vast assembly halls where servitors and tech priests constructed vehicles and weapons, storage facilities that held components and raw materials in carefully cataloged arrays, and the sacred spaces where tech priests performed their rituals and communed with the machine spirits they believed inhabited all technology. The architectural style of forge temples reflected Mechanicum aesthetic preferences and practical requirements. Exteriors typically featured heavy armor plating and defensive systems, protecting valuable manufacturing equipment from potential attack. The structures rose in blocky, functional designs that prioritized efficient internal layout over aesthetic concerns, though many forge temples incorporated decorative elements that honored the machine god through geometric patterns and symbolic representations of gears, circuits, and other technological motifs. Interior spaces emphasized utility, with wide corridors designed to accommodate servitor work gangs and the movement of large components, high ceilings that allowed overhead cranes to transport materials, and extensive cable runs and pipe networks that connected various systems throughout the complex. The treaty obligated the Imperium to support Forge World colonization efforts with resources and military protection. This support took multiple forms, each representing significant commitments of Imperial assets and personnel. Transport capacity for moving colonists and equipment to new Forge Worlds came from Imperial Navy vessels and civilian transport ships operating under Imperial charter. These vessels carried the massive quantities of materials and personnel necessary to establish new forge complexes, their holds packed with everything from mining equipment to prefabricated housing units to the sacred artifacts that would form the cores of new forge temple shrines. The naval resources dedicated to this transport duty could not be used for other purposes, representing an opportunity cost that Imperial military planners had to account for in their strategic calculations. Military protection for developing forge worlds required the deployment of Imperial army garrisons and naval patrols to systems where the Mechanicum was establishing new facilities. These forces defended against the numerous threats that might target vulnerable colonies during their development phases. Orc raiders might be attracted by the electromagnetic emissions from Forge World power plants and manufactorums. Eldar corsairs sometimes struck at isolated human colonies, their motivations often inscrutable, but their attacks devastating to settlements lacking proper defenses. Native populations on some worlds resisted colonization, their primitive weapons ineffective against Imperial forces, but capable of disrupting mining operations or sabotaging equipment if not contained. The garrison forces assigned to protect Forge Worlds remained under Imperial military command, but coordinated closely with Mechanicum security forces, their presence ensuring that tech priests could focus on industrial development rather than military defense. The establishment of new Forge Worlds created complex relationships between Mechanicum authorities and the existing populations of colonized planets. Many worlds claimed for Forge World development were uninhabited, their environments hostile to human life, without extensive technological support. These virgin worlds posed no political complications, allowing the Mechanicum to develop them according to purely technical considerations. However, some planets selected for Forge World status already supported human populations, typically descendants of colonies established during humanity's first expansion into the stars who had survived Old Night in isolation. These populations might number in the millions. Their societies developed over millennia of separation from the broader human civilization. The treaty granted the Mechanicum authority to assume governance over such worlds once they were designated for Forge World development, but the practical implementation of this authority required careful management to avoid provoking resistance that would disrupt industrial operations. The Mechanicum's approach to integrating existing populations varied based on local conditions and the preferences of the tech priests assigned to oversee development. Some Forge worlds absorbed native populations into their labor forces, offering them positions as menial workers in manufactorums or support roles in mining operations. The most capable individuals might even receive training as tech adepts, the lowest rank of the Mechanicum hierarchy, if they demonstrated appropriate aptitude and willingness to accept extensive cybernetic augmentation. Other Forge worlds established segregated zones where native populations could maintain their traditional societies, while the Mechanicum developed industrial facilities in separate regions, the two groups coexisting with minimal interaction. The most problematic situations arose when native populations actively resisted Mechanicum colonization, viewing the tech priests as invaders threatening their way of life. Such resistance required military suppression, with Imperial Army forces deployed to pacify hostile populations and secure Forge World territories. These campaigns could be brutal affairs, the Imperial forces possessing overwhelming technological superiority, but facing enemies who knew their homeworld's terrain intimately and fought with the desperation of people defending their homes. The Mechanicum typically preferred to avoid such conflicts when possible. Their tech priests focused on industrial development rather than counterinsurgency operations. However, the treaty's provisions meant that once a world was designated for Forge World status, resistance would be crushed regardless of the cost in lives or resources. Guaranteed Mechanicum representation in the Council of Terra ensured that Mars maintained political influence over imperial policy at the highest levels of government. The Council served as the primary advisory body to the Emperor during the Great Crusade, its members including the most powerful individuals in the nascent Imperium. The Fabricator General of Mars held a permanent seat on this council, attending sessions where strategic decisions affecting the entire Imperium were debated and determined. This representation gave the Mechanicum direct input into military planning, resource allocation, diplomatic initiatives, and all other matters of imperial governance. The Fabricator General could advocate for Mechanicum interests, ensure that treaty obligations were being honored, and coordinate Forge World production with broader imperial strategic objectives. The Council of Terra met in chambers within the Imperial Palace, the massive fortress complex that dominated the Himalayan mountains and served as the seat of imperial power. These sessions brought together individuals who commanded vast resources and wielded authority over billions of human lives. The Fabricator General sat among Terran nobility who had supported the Emperor during the Unification Wars, military commanders who led the expedition fleets pushing into unexplored regions of the galaxy, and the administrators who managed the growing imperial bureaucracy. The tech priest's presence in these gatherings represented Mars as an equal partner in the imperial project rather than a subordinate institution, the physical manifestation of the treaty's provisions regarding Mechanicum autonomy. The Fabricator General's participation in council deliberations required the tech priest to navigate complex political dynamics while representing Mechanicum interests effectively. The other council members often possessed limited understanding of technical matters, their expertise lying in military strategy, political maneuvering, or administrative management, rather than the intricacies of manufacturing and technological development. The Fabricator General needed to explain Mechanicum capabilities and limitations in terms these individuals could comprehend, translating technical constraints into strategic implications that council members could incorporate into their planning. When military commanders requested equipment that exceeded current production capacity, the fabricator general had to articulate why their requests could not be fulfilled immediately and propose alternative solutions that balanced military needs against manufacturing realities. The representation also functioned defensively, protecting Mechanicum interests against potential encroachment by other imperial institutions. Council members sometimes proposed policies that would have compromised Forge world autonomy or attempted to impose imperial authority over Mechanicum operations. The Fabricator General's presence allowed Mars to identify such proposals early and argue against them before they gained momentum. The Tech Priest could cite treaty provisions, explain how proposed policies would disrupt essential manufacturing operations, and if necessary invoke the Emperor's own commitment to honoring the agreements made during the treaty negotiations. This defensive function proved essential to maintaining the boundaries between Mechanicum and imperial authority that the treaty had established. The protection of Mechanicum internal affairs from imperial interference represented perhaps the treaty's most jealously guarded provision from Mars's perspective. The Tech Priests had accepted the Emperor's authority in matters of external policy and military strategy, but they insisted on complete autonomy regarding their own governance, religious practices, and internal operations. The treaty formalized this autonomy through explicit language prohibiting imperial officials from interfering in Mechanicum affairs, unless such interference was specifically authorized by treaty provisions or requested by Martian authorities. This protection extended to multiple domains that the Tech Priests considered essential to maintaining their unique character and independence. The Mechanicum's justice system operated according to principles entirely separate from imperial law. Tech Priests accused of crimes or violations of Mechanicum doctrine faced trial before tribunals composed of senior magi who examined evidence according to procedures established by ancient tradition and religious law. These tribunals applied standards of judgment that reflected Mechanicum values and priorities rather than imperial legal principles. Offenses that imperial law might consider minor could carry severe penalties under Mechanicum justice if they involved negligent treatment of sacred machinery or improper maintenance procedures. Conversely, actions that would constitute serious crimes under imperial law might be viewed differently by Tech Priest judges if they occurred in the context of pursuing technical knowledge or serving the machine god. The punishments imposed by Mechanicum tribunals reflected the Tech Priest's beliefs about the relationship between flesh and machine. Serious offenders might be subjected to extensive modification, their bodies altered through cybernetic surgery that removed capabilities or imposed limitations designed to prevent future violations. A Tech Priest convicted of stealing components from a forged temple might have their manipulator appendages replaced with simpler versions, lacking the fine motor control necessary to work with delicate equipment. Those guilty of more severe crimes faced complete reduction to servitor status, their higher cognitive functions suppressed through lobotomy and neural programming that left them capable only of following simple instructions. This transformation represented the ultimate punishment in Mechanicum society, the complete erasure of individual identity and reduction to a mere tool serving the machine god's purposes. The treaty guaranteed that imperial authorities could not interfere in these internal justice proceedings, even when they involved Tech Priests accused of crimes against imperial citizens or property. A Tech Priest who damaged imperial equipment or caused harm to non-Mechanicum personnel while working on imperial projects could claim the right to be tried under Mechanicum law. Imperial prosecutors could present evidence to Mechanicum tribunals, but the final judgment rested with Tech Priest judges applying their own legal standards. This arrangement created occasional tensions when imperial officials believed that Tech Priests had escaped appropriate punishment for serious offenses, but the treaty's provisions were clear, and the Emperor himself enforced them when disputes arose. The Tagmata military forces represented the Mechanicum's own armed forces, distinct from the Skitarii legions that served individual forge worlds. These formations consisted of tech priests who specialized in military applications of technology, warriors who combined extensive cybernetic augmentation with advanced weapons and equipment that often exceeded what was available to standard Imperial forces. The Tagmata operated under Mechanicum command authority, their deployment and operations determined by Martian strategic priorities rather than Imperial military requirements. The treaty protected the Tagmata from Imperial interference, establishing that these forces could not be requisitioned or commanded by Imperial officers without explicit Mechanicum consent. Secret research projects conducted in isolated forge complexes and hidden laboratories represented some of the Mechanicum's most sensitive activities. These projects pursued knowledge that the tech priests considered too dangerous or too sacred to share with the broader Imperium. Some research focused on attempting to reconstruct technologies from the Dark Age of technology using fragmentary STC data and corrupted archives. Other projects investigated xenotech recovered from alien civilizations, carefully studying the principles behind non-human technology while maintaining appropriate reverence for human engineering traditions. The most controversial research involved attempts to create new technologies through innovation rather than simply reproducing ancient patterns, work that pushed against Mechanicum doctrine regarding the sanctity of established designs, but which some tech priests believed necessary to advance human technological capabilities. The treaty's protection of these research projects meant that the Mechanicum could pursue investigations that might have been prohibited under Imperial law, or that contradicted the Emperor's own policies regarding certain types of knowledge. The tech priests maintained facilities where they studied warp-related phenomena, attempting to understand the principles that allowed ships to traverse the immaterium, despite the Emperor's general prohibition on research into warp mechanics outside carefully controlled parameters. They investigated artificial intelligence and machine consciousness, topics that carried enormous risks given humanity's history with rebellious machines during the cybernetic revolt, but which the Mechanicum believed essential to understanding the nature of machine spirits and the machine god. Imperial authorities could not inspect these facilities, could not demand reports on research findings, and could not shut down projects they deemed dangerous without violating the treaty's provisions regarding Mechanicum autonomy. The balance between Mechanicum autonomy and Imperial oversight remained a source of ongoing negotiation and occasional conflict throughout the Great Crusade. Imperial officials sometimes discovered Mechanicum research that they believed posed unacceptable risks to the Imperium's security or violated the Emperor's policies regarding forbidden knowledge. The tech priests argued that such research fell under their protected rights and that Imperial interference would violate the treaty's fundamental provisions. These disputes required resolution through the coordination mechanisms established by the treaty, with cases brought before joint councils where both sides could present their positions. The Emperor himself sometimes intervened in particularly contentious cases, his decisions establishing precedents that shaped how future disputes would be resolved. In most instances, the Emperor sided with the Mechanicum's right to conduct research according to their own judgment, his commitment to honoring the treaty's provisions outweighing concerns about specific projects, unless they posed immediate and demonstrable threats to Imperial security. The transformation of theoretical treaty provisions into practical military and industrial cooperation began almost immediately after the signing ceremony on Olympus Mons. The first major test of the partnership came with the Emperor's requirement to equip the Space Marine legions, whose numbers were expanding rapidly as the Great Crusade prepared to push beyond the solar system. The scale of this requirement challenged even the Mechanicum's vast manufacturing capacity. Each legion would eventually field tens of thousands of warriors, and each warrior needed complete sets of power armor, weapons, ammunition, and the countless other items of equipment necessary to prosecute campaigns across every conceivable battlefield environment. The forged temples of Mars and the newly established Martian orbital facilities began retooling their production lines to meet these unprecedented demands. The arming of the First Legion, later known as the Dark Angels, established patterns that would be replicated for subsequent legions. Mechanicum forge masters worked directly with the legion's armories and the Emperor's own artificers to finalize specifications for power armor that could withstand the punishment these enhanced warriors would face. The ceramite plates that formed the armor's outer shell required forging at temperatures that only the largest Martian foundries could achieve, their molecular structure aligned through processes that combined ancient knowledge with recent innovations developed through collaboration between Imperial and Mechanicum engineers. Each suit of Mark II power armor, the pattern that would become standard during the early Great Crusade, contained hundreds of individual components manufactured across different forged temples according to their specializations. Servomotors came from facilities that had perfected their production through millennia of experience. Power plants were assembled in secure forge complexes where tech priests maintained the sacred knowledge of plasma reactor miniaturization. The final assembly occurred in dedicated manufactorums where skilled artisans and their servitor assistants spent weeks on each suit, ensuring every system functioned perfectly before the armor was certified for issue to a space marine. The production of bolters and their ammunition consumed entire forge complexes dedicated solely to weapons manufacturing. The basic bolter pattern had existed since before Old Night, but adapting it for space marine use required modifications that pushed Mechanicum manufacturing capabilities. The weapons needed to be robust enough to function in any environment, from the frozen wastes of ice worlds to the superheated atmospheres of volcanic planets. The mass-reactive bolt rounds themselves presented particular challenges. Each round contained a miniature rocket motor that had to ignite reliably after being fired from the bolter's barrel, a shaped explosive charge that would detonate inside the target, and a hardened tip capable of penetrating armor before the explosive activated. The tolerances required for these components measured in microns, with any deviation potentially causing the round to malfunction. Mechanicum quality control procedures subjected samples from each production batch to exhaustive testing, tech priests examining every aspect of the ammunition's construction before certifying it suitable for Legion use. The construction of the Emperor's grand battle fleets represented an undertaking that dwarfed even the Legion equipment programs in scale and complexity. The orbital shipyards above Mars expanded continuously throughout the early years of the Great Crusade, their construction frameworks growing to accommodate vessels that measured kilometers in length. The Mechanicum shipwrights drew upon design patterns recovered from data vaults that contained fragmentary information about the warships that had carried humanity to the stars during the dark age of technology. These ancient designs required extensive modification and adaptation, the tech priests filling gaps in corrupted data with their own engineering knowledge while attempting to remain faithful to the sacred templates. The result was a fleet architecture that combined proven principles from humanity's past with innovations necessary to meet the Great Crusade's specific requirements. The battleship Invincible Reason, constructed for the First Legion, exemplified the capabilities that Mechanicum shipyards could achieve when given adequate resources and time. The vessel's keel was laid in the largest construction dock above Mars, a framework that stretched 8 kilometers in length and required 3 years simply to complete the basic structural elements. The hull plating alone consumed millions of tons of refined metals, thick armor that could withstand lance strikes and torpedo impacts that would gut lesser vessels. The ship's plasma drives, massive engines that would propel the battleship through real space, were manufactured in specialized forged temples on Mars's surface before being transported to orbit and installed through procedures that required perfect precision. A misalignment of even a few centimeters in the drive assembly could result in catastrophic failure when the engines fired at full power. The weapon's batteries that lined the Invincible Reason's flanks represented the accumulated expertise of Mechanicum weapons specialists who had studied naval gunnery for generations. Each battery contained dozens of individual weapons, their firing solutions calculated by cogitator banks that occupied entire decks within the ship's interior. The deployment of Titan legions to critical war zones during the Great Crusade's expansion demonstrated the Mechanicum's commitment to supporting Imperial military operations with their most powerful assets. The decision to commit a Titan legion to a particular campaign required extensive coordination between the Collegia Titanica, the forge world that maintained the god machines, and Imperial military commanders who requested their support. The process began with detailed assessments of the strategic situation, examining whether the deployment of Titans would prove decisive and whether the risks to these irreplaceable war engines could be justified. The tech priests of the Collegia Titanica maintained comprehensive records on every Titan under their control, tracking combat histories, maintenance requirements, and the status of the princeps bonded to each god machine. These records informed deployment decisions, ensuring that Titans were committed to battles where their capabilities would be fully utilized rather than wasted on campaigns that conventional forces could handle. The Legio Mortis, one of the oldest and most prestigious Titan legions sworn to Mars, participated in some of the Great Crusade's most significant campaigns during its early years. The legion's deployment to the Gardenal cluster exemplified how Titan support could break resistance that threatened to stall Imperial expansion for years. The cluster contained multiple heavily fortified worlds whose populations had developed sophisticated defensive technologies during their isolation in Old Night. Imperial army forces attempting to reduce these fortifications suffered heavy casualties, their artillery unable to penetrate shield generators and armored bunkers that had been constructed to withstand orbital bombardment. The arrival of Legio Mortis transformed the strategic situation completely. The warlord Titans Rex Furorum and Dominus Invictus led the assault on the primary fortress complex, their void shields absorbing defensive fire that would have destroyed entire regiments. The god machine's plasma weapons carved through fortifications that had resisted weeks of conventional bombardment, their destructive power creating breaches that allowed Imperial forces to storm positions that had seemed impregnable. The campaign that might have consumed years of attritional warfare concluded in months once the Titans deployed, though at the cost of significant damage to several god machines that required extensive repairs before they could fight again. The establishment of forge worlds across newly compliant systems proceeded according to patterns established by the treaty, but adapted to local conditions encountered as the Great Crusade pushed into regions of the galaxy that had been isolated from human contact for millennia. Mechanicum survey teams accompanied every major expedition fleet, their specialized equipment scanning each system for worlds that met the criteria for forge world development. The ideal candidates possessed abundant mineral resources, stable geological conditions that would not threaten industrial facilities with earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, and atmospheric compositions that could support human life with minimal technological intervention. Many systems contain no worlds meeting all these criteria, forcing the Mechanicum to make compromises based on which factors were most critical for their intended use of the facility. The Forge world of Griffon IV, established during the Great Crusade's expansion into the Segmentum Tempestus, demonstrated how the Mechanicum adapted their standard development procedures to exploit worlds with unusual characteristics. The planet possessed minimal surface water and an atmosphere too thin to support unaugmented humans without respirators, conditions that would have made it unsuitable for conventional colonization. However, geological surveys revealed extraordinary concentrations of rare metals and radioactive elements in the planet's crust, resources essential for advanced manufacturing processes and reactor construction. The Mechanicum committed to developing Griffon IV despite the environmental challenges, constructing sealed habitat domes that maintained breathable atmospheres while their mining operations extracted the valuable ores. The forge complexes built on Griffon IV specialized in plasma weapon production and reactor manufacturing, their output supplying imperial forces across multiple sectors. The world's population never exceeded several million tech priests and their servitor workforces, but the value of its industrial output far exceeded what more hospitable but resource-poor worlds could have contributed. The spread of forge worlds throughout imperial space created networks of Mechanicum authority that paralleled and sometimes competed with standard imperial administrative structures. In systems containing both forge worlds and conventionally governed imperial planets, questions of jurisdiction and authority arose with increasing frequency. Forge worlds required raw materials that often came from mining operations on nearby planets under imperial governors' control. The governors wanted payment for these resources, or expected forge worlds to provide manufactured goods in exchange, but the Mechanicum argued that treaty provisions gave them priority access to resources necessary for fulfilling their obligations to supply imperial military forces. Disputes over resource allocation required arbitration through the joint councils established by the treaty, with both sides presenting arguments about their respective needs and rights. The resolution of these disputes established precedents that would govern Mechanicum imperial relations for millennia, gradually building a body of case law that defined the boundaries between the two power structures. The growing tensions between Mechanicum and imperial authorities became increasingly apparent as the Great Crusade progressed, and the initial enthusiasm of partnership gave way to the frustrations of managing complex relationships under battlefield conditions. Imperial commanders grew impatient with what they perceived as Mechanicum inflexibility regarding production schedules and equipment specifications. A general planning, a campaign might request specific modifications to standard vehicle patterns to better suit the terrain and enemy forces he expected to face, only to have Mechanicum forge masters reject the request as deviation from sacred templates. The tech priests explained that modifying approved patterns required extensive testing and theological review to ensure the changes would not offend machine spirits or compromise the equipment's reliability, processes that could take months or years. The generals argued that by the time modified equipment was approved and manufactured, the campaign would be over and the modifications irrelevant. These conflicts reflected fundamentally different perspectives on the relationship between technology and warfare, with imperial officers prioritizing tactical flexibility, while Mechanicum doctrine emphasized adherence to proven designs. The interpretation of treaty provisions regarding Mechanicum autonomy versus imperial authority became increasingly contentious as situations arose that the original negotiators had not anticipated. The treaty clearly established that forge worlds fell under Mechanicum jurisdiction, but what about facilities that the Mechanicum constructed on imperial worlds to support local military forces? Did these smaller forge complexes enjoy the same autonomy as full forge worlds, or did they fall under the authority of planetary governors? The Mechanicum argued that any facility they constructed remained under their control regardless of its location, citing treaty language about sovereignty over all Mechanicum assets. Imperial administrators countered that the treaty's provisions regarding forge worlds applied specifically to planets designated for that purpose, not to individual buildings or complexes on otherwise imperial-governed worlds. The resolution of these disputes often depended on which side had more political leverage in specific situations, rather than clear legal principles, creating inconsistencies that frustrated both Mechanicum and imperial officials. The discovery and control of archaeotech became a particularly contentious issue, as expedition fleets encountered increasing numbers of human worlds that had preserved technologies from before Old Night. The treaty granted the Mechanicum exclusive rights to claim all archaeotech discoveries, but imperial commanders sometimes argued that weapons or equipment found on conquered worlds should be immediately available for military use rather than transported to Mars for study. The most serious disputes arose when expedition fleets discovered intact STC systems or fragments thereof, finds so valuable that both the Mechanicum and imperial authorities believed they held strategic importance that transcended normal treaty provisions. The Mechanicum maintained that SDC systems represented sacred knowledge, that only they possessed the expertise to properly study and preserve. Imperial officials argued that technologies recovered during imperial military campaigns should serve imperial interests first, with the Mechanicum's research priorities taking secondary importance to immediate military applications. The incident on Sedna's world illustrated how these tensions could escalate into serious conflicts that threaten the partnership between Mars and Terra. An expedition fleet discovered extensive ruins from the dark age of technology on the planet's surface, including what appeared to be an intact research facility containing multiple SDC fragments. The Mechanicum representatives with the fleet immediately claimed the site under treaty provisions and began establishing security perimeters to protect it while they organized proper archaeological excavation. The expedition's military commander, facing heavy casualties in ongoing campaigns against Orc forces in neighboring systems, demanded access to any weapons technology that might be recovered from the facility. His forces were dying while the tech priests conducted their methodical investigations, and he believed that immediate tactical needs outweighed archaeological protocols. When Mechanicum security forces refused him entry to the site, the commander considered ordering his troops to seize it by force, a decision that would have constituted a direct violation of the treaty and potentially triggered armed conflict between Imperial and Mechanicum forces. The resolution of the Sedna's world crisis required intervention from the highest levels of both Imperial and Mechanicum authority. The Fabricator General traveled from Mars to personally oversee the situation, while the Emperor dispatched one of his closest advisors to represent Imperial interests. The negotiations lasted weeks, during which both sides made their positions clear. The Mechanicum would not tolerate Imperial forces seizing archaeotech sites by force, viewing such actions as violations of treaty provisions that would justify suspending their cooperation with the Great Crusade. Imperial authorities insisted that the Mechanicum's exclusive rights to archaeotech could not be allowed to interfere with urgent military operations that affected the survival of Imperial forces. The compromise that emerged established new protocols for handling archaeotech discoveries in active war zones. Mechanicum teams would conduct rapid initial assessments to identify any technologies with immediate military applications, which would be made available to Imperial forces after appropriate safety testing. The full archaeological investigation and study of recovered artifacts would proceed according to normal Mechanicum procedures, but the most urgent military needs would be addressed first. This resolution satisfied neither side completely, but prevented the immediate crisis from escalating into open conflict. The divergent interpretations of treaty terms became increasingly apparent as both sides developed their own bodies of precedent and practice for implementing the agreement's provisions. The Mechanicum interpreted their autonomy broadly, arguing that treaty language protecting their internal affairs from Imperial interference meant that they could refuse requests for information about their capabilities, reject proposed modifications to production schedules, and maintain complete secrecy regarding their research projects. Imperial administrators developed narrower interpretations, suggesting that the treaty's provisions should be read in light of their underlying purpose of supporting the Great Crusade, rather than as absolute grants of authority that could be used to obstruct Imperial military operations. The lack of a clear mechanism for resolving these interpretive disputes meant that each controversy had to be negotiated individually, consuming time and political capital that both sides would have preferred to direct toward prosecuting the Great Crusade. The establishment of forge worlds in regions distant from Mars created additional complications, as these facilities developed their own identities and priorities that sometimes diverged from Martian policy. Forge worlds on the eastern fringe of the expanding Imperium found themselves dealing with threats and opportunities that Mars, located near Terra in the galactic west, could not fully appreciate. Local forge masters made decisions based on their immediate circumstances, sometimes entering into arrangements with nearby Imperial governors or military commanders that Mars would not have approved. The Fabricator General's authority over all Forge worlds remained theoretically absolute, but the practical difficulties of maintaining control across interstellar distances meant that distant Forge worlds enjoyed considerable de facto autonomy. This decentralization would have profound implications for the Mechanicum's unity and its relationship with the broader Imperium as the Great Crusade continued its expansion across the galaxy. The stability that the Treaty of Olympus Mons had established between Mars and Terra endured for nearly 2 centuries as the Great Crusade pushed across the galaxy. The partnership between the Mechanicum and the Imperium, despite its tensions and occasional disputes, had proven remarkably successful in achieving the Emperor's vision of reuniting scattered human worlds under a single government. Forge worlds dotted Imperial space, their manufactorums producing the weapons and equipment that supplied armies fighting on thousands of battlefields simultaneously. The Space Marine legions, equipped and maintained through Mechanicum expertise, had become the Emperor's most effective instruments of conquest. Titan legions had broken sieges that conventional forces could never have overcome. The relationship between tech priest and imperial officer, while sometimes strained by conflicting priorities and cultural differences, had developed into functional cooperation that served both parties' interests. The Horus Heresy shattered this carefully constructed partnership with a violence that threatened to destroy both the Imperium and the Mechanicum. The betrayal of Warmaster Horus, the Emperor's most trusted son, and the commander of the Great Crusade's military forces, created a civil war that split the Imperium along multiple fault lines. Space Marine legions turned against each other, their gene-enhanced warriors bringing the same ferocity they had directed against humanity's enemies to bear against their former brothers. The Imperial army fractured as regiments chose sides based on their commanders' loyalties or the strategic situations in which they found themselves. The conflict consumed entire sectors, with worlds that had known peace for generations suddenly finding themselves battlegrounds where the fate of human civilization would be decided. Mars did not escape this catastrophe. Fabricator General Kelber Hal, who had led the Mechanicum for decades and maintained the partnership with Terra throughout the Great Crusade's expansion, made a decision that would have consequences as profound as the original treaty itself. He chose to side with Horus against the Emperor, bringing significant portions of the Mechanicum into open rebellion against the authority they had acknowledged for 2 centuries. The reasons behind this betrayal were complex, rooted in theological disputes, political calculations, and promises that Horus made regarding knowledge and technology that the Warmaster claimed the Emperor had kept hidden from the Mechanicum. Kelber Hal argued that the Emperor had never truly been the Omnissiah, that his recognition as the machine god's avatar had been a political arrangement rather than genuine divine manifestation. The Warmaster, the Fabricator General suggested, offered the Mechanicum true partnership without the restrictions and oversight that imperial authority imposed. The schism within the Mechanicum proceeded with shocking speed once Kelber Hal declared his position. Forge worlds across the galaxy received transmissions from Mars explaining the Fabricator General's decision and calling upon them to join the rebellion against Terra. The responses varied dramatically based on local conditions, the personalities of Forge world leadership, and the relationships individual Forge complexes had developed with nearby imperial authorities. Some Forge worlds immediately declared for Horus, their tech priests viewing Kelber Hal's authority as absolute and his theological arguments as compelling. These facilities began redirecting their production away from loyalist imperial forces, instead supplying traitor legions and the armies that Horus was assembling for his march on Terra. Other Forge worlds rejected the Fabricator General's call entirely, their leaders arguing that the treaty bound them to the Emperor regardless of Mars's position, and that abandoning this obligation would constitute betrayal of sacred oaths. The civil war that erupted on Mars itself demonstrated how completely the schism had fractured Mechanicum unity. Forge temples that had cooperated for millennia turned their weapons against each other, their Skitarii forces fighting battles through the industrial complexes and across the rust-red surface. The scale of destruction was immense, with plasma weapons and volkite rays reducing entire manufactorums to molten slag. Titan legions split along factional lines, with some god machines siding with Kelber Hal, while others remained loyal to the treaty and the Emperor. The sight of Titans fighting each other represented a profound violation of Mechanicum traditions. These sacred war engines that should have been directed against humanity's enemies, instead destroying each other in battles that left massive craters across the Martian landscape. The treaty's provisions regarding Mechanicum autonomy created significant complications for both sides during the Civil War. Loyalist Imperial forces could not simply invade Mars and depose Kelber Hal without violating the same treaty provisions they claimed to be defending. The Fabricator General maintained that he remained the legitimate leader of the Mechanicum, and that his decisions regarding alliance with Horus fell within the authority granted to Mars by the treaty. From his perspective, the Mechanicum was exercising its right to determine its own policies and relationships with external powers. The fact that this decision involved breaking with the Emperor did not, in Kelber Hal's argument, constitute a treaty violation, because the treaty had always established Mars as a sovereign power that chose alliance rather than accepting subordination. Loyalist tech priests rejected this interpretation entirely, arguing that the treaty bound the Mechanicum to the Emperor specifically, and that Kelber Hal's betrayal represented a fundamental violation of sacred oaths that invalidated his authority. These loyalists pointed to the recognition of the Emperor as the Omnissiah, a theological commitment that transcended mere political arrangements. By declaring against the Emperor, Kelber Hal had committed heresy against the machine god itself, making him unfit to lead the Mechanicum regardless of his formal position. The debate over treaty interpretation became inseparable from theological arguments about the nature of the Omnissiah and the machine god's will, with both sides claiming that their position represented true adherence to Mechanicum doctrine. The practical impact of this split extended far beyond Mars itself. Forge worlds that sided with Horus began supplying traitor forces with equipment and weapons that gave them capabilities matching or exceeding what loyalist armies could field. The traitor legions received new marks of power armor incorporating modifications that some tech priests had been developing in secret, improvements that the conservative elements within the Mechanicum had previously blocked as deviations from sacred patterns. Weapons that had been restricted to Mechanicum use found their way into traitor arsenals, including sophisticated plasma weapons and volkite technology that Imperial Army forces rarely accessed. The industrial capacity that had been built up over 2 centuries of Great Crusade expansion now served both sides of the Civil War, ensuring that the conflict would be fought with the full destructive potential of human technology. The Siege of Terra represented the ultimate test of the relationships that the treaty had established. As Horus's forces approached the solar system, the question of Mars's role became critical to both sides' strategic calculations. The traitor Fabricator General controlled significant portions of Martian industrial capacity and commanded Mechanicum forces that could either support or oppose the assault on the Imperial Palace. However, the civil war raging across Mars meant that Kelber Hal could not commit the full strength of the Forge world to Horus's cause. Loyalist tech priests and their Skitarii forces tied down traitor units that might otherwise have been deployed to Terra, their resistance preventing Kelber Hal from delivering the overwhelming industrial support that Horus had expected when the Fabricator General first declared for the War Master. The death of Kelber Hal during the heresy remains shrouded in conflicting accounts and deliberate obscuration by authorities who had reasons to suppress certain details. Some records suggest he died during the fighting on Mars itself, killed by loyalist forces who managed to penetrate the defenses of his forge complex and eliminate him in close combat. Other accounts place his death later, during the Siege of Terra or its immediate aftermath, with various explanations for the circumstances. The lack of clarity regarding exactly when and how the traitor Fabricator General died reflects the chaos of the period and the subsequent efforts by loyalist authorities to shape the historical narrative in ways that served their purposes. what remains certain is that Kelber Hal's death eliminated the individual whose authority had legitimized the Mechanicum split, creating an opportunity for loyalist forces to reassert control over Mars and the broader Mechanicum. Zagreus Kane emerged as the new Fabricator General in the aftermath of Kelber Hal's death and the heresy's conclusion. Kane had maintained loyalty to the Emperor throughout the Civil War, leading resistance against traitor forces on Mars and coordinating with Imperial authorities despite the enormous pressures to join the rebellion. His selection as Fabricator General represented both a practical choice and a symbolic statement about the Mechanicum's future relationship with the Imperium. Kane possessed the technical expertise and political acumen necessary to rebuild Martian industrial capacity that had been devastated by years of civil war. More importantly, his demonstrated loyalty during the heresy made him acceptable to Imperial authorities who were deeply suspicious of the Mechanicum after Kelber Hal's betrayal. The reaffirmation of the Treaty of Olympus Mons under Kane's leadership required extensive negotiations that addressed the damage done to Mechanicum Imperial relations during the heresy. Imperial authorities, led by the newly formed Council of Terra that governed in the Emperor's absence after his internment in the Golden Throne, demanded guarantees that the Mechanicum would never again split in its loyalties. Some voices within the Imperial government argued for fundamental revisions to the treaty that would reduce Mechanicum autonomy and bring Mars under more direct Imperial control. These proposals suggested that the heresy had demonstrated the dangers of allowing any institution to maintain the degree of independence that the Mechanicum enjoyed, that the treaty's provisions regarding sovereignty and autonomy had enabled Kelber Hal's betrayal and should be curtailed to prevent future rebellions. Kane resisted these attempts to fundamentally alter the treaty's provisions, arguing that the Mechanicum's autonomy remained essential to its ability to fulfill its obligations to the Imperium. He pointed out that loyalist Forge Worlds had maintained their commitments throughout the heresy precisely because the treaty bound them to the Emperor rather than to whoever held the position of Fabricator General. The treaty's structure, which established Mars as a sovereign power choosing alliance rather than accepting subordination, had actually helped preserve loyalist resistance by giving tech priests a framework for rejecting Kelber Hal's authority when he violated the treaty's fundamental terms. Reducing Mechanicum autonomy, Kane argued, would not prevent future betrayals, but would instead undermine the very foundations that had allowed loyalists to maintain their resistance during the Civil War. The compromise that emerged preserved the treaty's essential provisions, while adding new mechanisms intended to prevent future schisms. The Mechanicum reaffirmed its recognition of the Emperor as the Omnissiah and committed to maintaining this theological position as fundamental doctrine that could not be altered by any Fabricator General's decision. The treaty's provisions regarding Forge World sovereignty and Mechanicum control over technology remained intact, but new coordination procedures were established to ensure better communication between Mars and Terra regarding strategic decisions and resource allocation. The Fabricator General's seat on the Council of Terra gained additional importance, with the position now explicitly recognized as one of the High Lords of Terra, the small group of individuals who collectively governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name. The purge of traitor elements from the Mechanicum proceeded with ruthless efficiency under Kane's direction. Forge Worlds that had sided with Horus faced investigation and punishment ranging from replacement of their leadership to complete suppression of their populations. Tech priests who had supported Kelber Hal were hunted across Imperial space, their knowledge and expertise valued enough that many were offered opportunities to recant their heresy and return to loyalist service, though always under suspicion and constant monitoring. The most unrepentant traitors faced execution or reduction to servitor status, their higher cognitive functions destroyed as punishment for their betrayal. The Titan legions that had fought for Horus were disbanded or absorbed into loyalist formations, their war engines repainted and rededicated to service of the Emperor and the machine god. The physical reconstruction of Mars consumed decades of intensive effort. The Civil War had devastated forge complexes that had stood since before Old Night, their ancient machinery reduced to wreckage by weapons that should never have been turned against fellow tech priests. Entire regions of the planet's surface had been transformed into radioactive wastelands, where even heavily augmented tech priests could not survive without extensive protection. The data vaults beneath Olympus Mons had suffered damage during the fighting, with irreplaceable records from the dark age of technology lost forever when traitor forces attempted to seize or destroy them rather than allow them to fall into loyalist hands. The reconstruction required not just physical rebuilding, but also the restoration of knowledge and expertise that had been lost when tech priests on both sides died during the conflict. The heresy's impact on the broader Mechanicum extended far beyond Mars itself. Forge worlds across the galaxy had to be assessed for their loyalty and reliability, with imperial authorities demanding proof that they had not been compromised by traitor influence. The relationships between Forge worlds and the Space Marine chapters that emerged from the Broken Legions required careful renegotiation, as the old partnerships that had existed during the Great Crusade no longer applied in the Imperium's new structure. Some Forge worlds found themselves supplying chapters whose parent legions they had fought against during the heresy, creating tensions that would persist for millennia. The trust that had gradually developed between tech priests and imperial officers during the Great Crusade had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and constant vigilance against potential betrayal. The theological implications of Kelberhal's betrayal forced the Mechanicum to re-examine fundamental aspects of their doctrine regarding the Omnissiah and the machine god. If the Fabricator General himself could fall into heresy despite his position and knowledge, what did that mean for the Mechanicum's understanding of divine will and proper worship? Some tech priests argued that Kelberhal's fall proved that the machine god's favor required more than just technical expertise and adherence to ritual, that true understanding demanded loyalty to the Emperor as the Omnissiah above all other considerations. Others suggested that the heresy revealed the dangers of the theological compromise that had been made during the original treaty negotiations, that accepting the Emperor as the Omnissiah had introduced contradictions into Mechanicum doctrine that had ultimately enabled the schism. These theological debates would continue for millennia, shaping how different Forge worlds and Mechanicum factions understood their relationship with the Imperium and their obligations under the treaty. The enduring impact of the Treaty of Olympus Mons on the Imperium of the 41st millennium demonstrates both the agreement's fundamental soundness and the ways in which it has been tested and modified by 10,000 years of history. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as the Mechanicum came to be known in High Gothic, remains semi-autonomous within the Imperium structure. Forge worlds continue to operate under Mechanicum jurisdiction rather than standard Imperial administration. The tech priests maintain their worship of the machine god and the Omnissiah despite the Imperium's official rejection of religious thinking that the Emperor had originally promoted. The Fabricator General of Mars holds a permanent position among the High Lords of Terra, ensuring that Mechanicum interests receive representation in the Imperium's highest governing body. The treaty's provisions regarding technology monopoly have, if anything, grown more absolute over the millennia. The Adeptus Mechanicus controls virtually all advanced manufacturing within the Imperium, their forge worlds producing everything from lasguns for Imperial Guard regiments to the mighty warships of the Imperial Navy. The tech priests' exclusive rights to archaeotech and SDC discoveries remain unchallenged, though the practical implementation of these rights has been complicated by 10,000 years of precedent and the Imperium's vast size. The relationship between Forge worlds and the Imperial institutions they supply has evolved into complex webs of obligation and mutual dependence, with neither side able to function effectively without the other, despite their formal separation. The tensions that emerged during the Great Crusade between Mechanicum autonomy and Imperial authority persist into the 41st millennium, manifested in disputes over production priorities, resource allocation, and the interpretation of treaty provisions that were written in a very different era. Forge worlds sometimes refuse requests from Imperial commanders, citing treaty protections or claiming that their obligations to other forces take precedence. Imperial officials complain about Mechanicum inflexibility and secrecy, arguing that the tech priest's monopoly over technology hinders the Imperium's ability to respond effectively to the countless threats it faces. Yet the fundamental partnership endures because both sides recognize that the alternatives would be worse. The Imperium cannot function without Mechanicum manufacturing capacity and technological expertise. The Adeptus Mechanicus cannot survive without Imperial protection and access to the resources that only the Imperium's vast territories can provide. The ancient compact forged on Olympus Mons in the early 31st millennium continues to shape the Imperium's structure and function 10,000 years later. The treaty survived the greatest test it would ever face during the Horus Heresy, emerging damaged, but intact from a civil war that destroyed so much else. The relationship between Mars and Terra, between tech priest and Imperial official, between the cult Mechanicus and the broader Imperium, remains defined by provisions negotiated when the Emperor walked among humanity, and the Great Crusade promised to reunite all human worlds under a single government. That the treaty still functions after millennia of war, corruption, and decay speaks to both the wisdom of its original architects and the fundamental necessities that drove its creation. The Imperium needs the Mechanicum's technology, and the Mechanicum needs the Imperium's protection and resources. This mutual dependence, formalized in the Treaty of Olympus Mons, remains as relevant in the 41st millennium as it was when the Emperor and the Fabricator General first met on Mars to forge their alliance.